Chapter 21 Dance. As Mickey followed the guard through a long corridor, Percy was reevaluating his life choices. How had he found himself hitching a ride on a walking corpse, escorted to a fight through a dungeon? Not to mention, this place had somehow turned out even crueler than Remier. Mickey might be their prisoner, but these people didn't seem to know nor care he just died. Surely, they could give him a day off. Oblivious to his thoughts, the guard soon brought them to a large barred gate, an ominous red light seeping through the gaps. Stopping, the man made some kind of whistling sound, and a few moments later, Percy heard a loud metallic noise. It was grating, like a rusty chain grinding against something hard. At the same time, the gate was slowly lifted by the mechanism. Mickey stepped through as the guard stayed behind. He walked into an open space, to the cacophony of jeers and boos, which only intensified upon their arrival. Percy's host scanned their surroundings slowly, which he figured was done for his sake. The stands surrounded them in all directions, stretching up for over 100 meters, and they were filled to the brim with eager spectators, clearly itching to enjoy the barbaric event. Most of the crowd was too far to make out, but many of those closest appeared to be the same species as Mickey, albeit lacking the tattoos again, like the guard. Why do this to one of your own? His host had a visceral reaction to that thought. Percy felt phlegm accumulate in their throat, before Mickey spat out the half-chewed head of the rodent, covered in thick bile. Please, never do this again. Your fault, for calling this trash my own. Mickey snapped back. Then he looked up at a sky painted red, reminiscent of a sunset back on Remier. Yet here it was the middle of the day. The local sun was at its apex, bathing Huehue in a dim crimson light. The sand blanketing the arena was red too, but a different brownish shade. Mixed with the blood of countless combatants, it was coarse and sticky, with the occasional bony shard jutting out. Mickey ignored those, as they failed to pierce his calloused feet, making his way to the center of the arena. Can you even fight like this? His host shrugged. Then, Percy felt the muscles in their abdomen tense, forcefully closing the injury. It hurt like a bitch, causing them to wince, though it was practical. Next, the core in their sternum stirred, flooding their body with potent mana. Having recently acquired a pure affinity himself, the substance felt somewhat familiar to Percy. Still, it was weird coming out of his chest rather than his abdomen and at a higher grade than he was used to. Soon, it gathered on the wound, further sealing it in a film of pale cyan. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. Ruhar! A thunderous bellow came from the other end of the arena, as faint tremors reached their feet, and they grew more fierce over the next few seconds as another gate opened, revealing their opponent. It was a large bear-like creature, taller than Mickey even on all six. Its green fur was long and curly, which might have made the creature look cute, if it hadn't been for its curved claws and twisting horns. Its snout was wide, with sharp fangs protruding out of its mouth, making it resemble a crocodile's maw. Mickey activated Mana Sense, letting the two examine its grade. Yellow. Percy wasn't happy. Beasts were generally dumber than sentient beings, but they possessed a special affinity that made up for it. Greatly strengthening their bodies with each promotion, it turned them into fierce opponents even for somebody at their grade. And that was assuming that person had a proper affinity themselves. Mickey pulled mana from his core again, this time to his hands, forging it into 4 short staves. He hit them together a couple of times, nodding in satisfaction as he verified their hardness. Still, that did little to assuage Percy's worry. It wasn't like pure mana was completely useless. It could still form proper spells, and there were people who ascended all the way to godhood with it. But it hadn't earned its reputation as the weakest affinity by accident either. It was far less flexible than water or air, and not nearly as sturdy as earth, or as lethal as fire and lightning. Even calling it a jack-of-all-trades was an overstatement. Perhaps a jack-of-no-trades was more apparent, adding Mickey's suboptimal condition, and Percy wasn't optimistic about their odds. Not wanting to negatively affect his host, he tried to steer away from those thoughts, but they must have seeped through. Mickey chuckled. I know what you're thinking, and you're not exactly wrong. Lacking any affinities, Huehue used to be one of the weakest worlds, constantly losing ground to others. Then, their calves tensed like steel coils, as Mickey jolted towards the monster with shocking speed. He was quicker than a yellow had any right to be, clearly having honed his body to its very limits. His technique was nothing to scoff at either, perfectly timing the swings of his upper arms to close into the beast's head from both sides. However, the Crocobear was no slouch either, raising a paw faster than its bulk should have allowed, slashing down violently. Percy felt their bones creak, as the shockwaves sent ripples through their skin. Bent under the tremendous weight of the claws, one of the rods was already cracked. They'd all shatter the next instant, but Mickey never gave them the chance. Having expected the parry, he stabbed forward with his lower arms, hitting the creature's chin. The impact sent its head up by a few inches, a few bloody fangs spluttering out. Yet it was far from enough. Enraged, the beast swiped with a second paw, this time slashing directly at Mickey's chest. Percy felt all 4 elbows bend, the mana flowing to reinforce the damaged weapon, as the rods moved to block the incoming blow. It was even heavier than the one before, but Mickey loosened his footing at the last second, letting himself slide back a dozen meters to lessen the impact. Two of the staves had still snapped in half. As the young man had thought, his host was at a severe disadvantage. He just couldn't see a way out of this. Mickey pulled some more mana to repair the weapons but didn't stop there. He pushed it into his channels, keeping it in his body. Then, he took a deep breath as Percy felt the strands of ambient mana enter their lungs, swirling like water down a drain. Their core had previously been at half its capacity, Mickey having already exhausted much of his reserves, though it began refilling rapidly as he continued to pump mana into his pathways. At this rate, it would take less than a minute to max out. My ancestors labored over countless generations to develop a technique that made us famous in the cosmos. Percy's eyes would have widened had he been the one in control. The beast was already charging at them, but Mickey didn't appear concerned. He continued to absorb mana as his channels swelled. Countless thin threads like veins began glowing under his skin. As soon as the monster was upon them, Mickey pivoted on his heel, narrowly avoiding being impaled by its horns. Then, he stomped hard with his other foot, all the muscles in his body bulging. Somehow even more than before. The mana burned its way through their lower arms, making the weapons glow brighter as they lunged upwards. Percy felt the beast's ribs give way under the fierce strike, the force even lifting its giant visage an inch off the ground. It growled again in fury, before its maw snapped shut, droplets of boiling spittle falling in all directions as the creature seethed. This time it swiped sideways with two of its paws, or tried to, at least. Mickey's movements were too fast for Percy to fully track, though he seemed to have struck one of its knees with a staff, stopping it before it picked up momentum. As for the second paw, he'd failed to see how his host had dodged it. As Mickey tiptoed around the monster, his footwork elegant like a dance. Then, he leapt backwards, putting some distance from the disoriented beast. At its highest level, the technique allows one to fight a full grade above their own. Only then did Percy realize their core was about to reach full capacity. With one last breath, it hit its limits. But still, Mickey didn't stop inhaling mana. The pressure was intense, making Percy fear both the core and the channels were about to burst. When the glowing lines on their skin shone even more brightly, Percy had only managed a fleeting glance, but the mana seemed to flow in certain patterns, tracing along the tribal tattoos, hinting at the order in which they were meant to be read. A few scarce motes of cyan leaked out of their body, as the rods felt hotter to the touch. It made up for our shortcomings, finally letting our gods stand tall against others, giving the technique its name. The beast regained its bearing, glaring at them with unconcealed fury, though it wasn't as quick to attack this time. Instead, it was Mickey who dashed forward. Before he even reached the creature, he took a few strange steps, twisting his path. The monster's attack hit empty air as Mickey delivered 3 swift strikes from various angles. Every time a rod landed, a bone shattered. Saying that Percy had a front row seat to the spectacle would be an understatement. Inside Mickey's body, he could feel every muscle flexing, every wisp of mana moving, every pivot of their feet, every sharp swing of the weapons. But even then, he could barely track a tenth of Mickey's actions. His host wasn't only manipulating the staves with his hands. They bounced off his elbows and even his knees, as they swished through the air erratically, stabbing and crushing and slashing at the creature from seemingly random angles. At one point, Mickey even kicked the bottom of a rod with his heel, slamming the other end right onto the monster's horn, smashing it into splinters. 5 minutes later, the beast was lying on the ground, its pained cries having softened, its breath slowing down. It was battered, its limbs bent in all the wrong directions, countless craters tearing into its flesh. Percy stared at the monster in horror. A short while earlier he'd been wondering how they could possibly escape its clutches, only to watch it slaughtered in such a brutal manner. Then Mickey spoke again. It's called The Dance of the Savage Gods. Chapter 22, Kicklit. The two were back in the cell, the foul smell of blood now dominating the earthy sense of the cave. Mickey didn't seem bothered, however, as he pecked chunks off the Crocobear's severed leg. Being allowed to eat their kills was apparently one of the few joys afforded to the prisoners of the Colosseum. Not that Percy particularly enjoyed the taste of the still-bleeding meal. He preferred his food cooked. At least this one was fresh, surprisingly tender too. A yellow beast's flesh was supposed to be tougher, but his host had softened it quite a bit after that massacre of a bout. So, I take it your people were attacked out of greed? Mickey nodded. Originally, our enemies only wanted our resources. Upon perfecting the dance, my ancestors managed to turn the situation around for a few millennia, regaining some of the lost territories. But the only thing we achieved was to give our foes an even greater reason for coveting our world. Eventually, they joined forces with a few other races to conquer Hué. But why? Does it even work with other affinities? Fighting above one's grade was certainly valuable, but if it only worked with pure mana, then the advantage would be offset by its weakness. In that case, it would be priceless for the people of Hué, yet not quite as much for others. Sadly, yes. Hearing that, Percy's feelings were mixed. Part of him did want it to work solely with his second core, to finally make it worth it. Stumbling upon a powerful technique that only worked because of his affinity sure sounded better than one that did so despite it. But he shook those thoughts away, knowing they were silly. It's better this way. I can use it with both cores. The only question now was whether Mickey would be willing to pass his people's heritage to an outsider. Might as well. Percy thought he'd heard wrong. Just an hour ago you were willing to destroy your own soul to keep me out of your body. Mickey shrugged. Well, by now it's obvious you aren't related to our enemies. I don't mind helping you out. It's not like I have anything better to do either. But what's in it for you? You've already given me everything I could ask for, which isn't much really. It's not like I have some grand ambition. I figured it would be nice to have a couple more fights. And if I'm lucky, maybe another shot at the bastard who killed me. The young man was at a loss for words. You're already getting those things for free. Why put in the effort? Mickey chuckled. This is the part where you thank me and quit while you're ahead. Are you trying to get me not to teach you? Well, no. Of course I'm happy to take the freebie. I just thought it's a little too easy. His host sighed. Percival, had you visited Huehue 10,000 years ago asking for our technique? I'm sure my ancestors would have skinned you alive, but right now all the people I hate the most already have it. As I see it, passing it to somebody else before I die is my best chance at preserving my legacy and spiting my enemies. Mickey coughed, Percy feeling the taste of iron accumulate in their mouth, before his host wiped something sticky off the bottom of his beak. This blood wasn't from the food. How long do you think we even have? Beats me. Mickey shifted in his seat, the movement sending another jolt of pain through their body. Unlike before, he had to use one of his lower hands to keep the wound closed. Despite the measures he'd taken during the fight to protect it, it had still widened by about an inch. While powerful, the dance of the savage gods clearly took a toll on its user. Carelessly tossing the naked bone away, Mickey pushed himself up, walking to a different corner of the cell. The dim light of the torch didn't reach that spot, so Percy hadn't noticed there was something here earlier. Reaching down, his host picked up a strange piece of bone, crafted into some sort of intricate tool. No, not a tool. An instrument. It looked a little like an ivory flute, but it had two shafts, way too many holes, and was wide like a trumpet on one end. That's the thing you mentioned earlier. A creaky tick. A kicklet, but yes. Mickey rolled his eyes. My mother played one for me as a child. A few years ago, I convinced the wardens to let me craft one after winning a lot of matches in a row. Next, he sat down again, moving the object to his face. That's when Percy understood that, unlike a trumpet, one was supposed to blow at the kicklet from the wide end, the beak going inside the hole. Which frankly made sense, given the locals' physiology. The young man figured his host would have a tough time playing with one hand occupied, yet Mickey seemed to manage just fine. If anything, he appeared quite skilled with it too, his fingers moving swiftly but gently, tapping some of the holes while brushing over others. Then he blew a strained breath into the kicklet, causing it to emit a soft tune. The melody was crisp and strangely uplifting, like something a mother would play for her child to cheer them up. For a second, Percy almost forgot he was still inside a corpse, trapped in a cell atop a broken world. Yet, a second tune subtly underscored the first. A kid would have missed this one, and perhaps Percy might have too, if not for Mickey's emotions seeping through their connection. This hidden layer spoke of struggles against adversity, and of the fight for one's place in the world. Like a people cursed without an affinity, trying to protect their home. Or a boy born with a red core, looked down upon by all. Mickey played for hours, the mellow notes bouncing off the cold walls. Every few minutes a cough interrupted the music, each time sounding worse. Still, it always resumed soon after, as if it would be a crime to rob Huehue of even this minor consolation. So absorbed was Percy in the melody, he nearly failed to register the warm trickle down his cheek. It slowly flowed down his face, before dripping off his chin. The tears sputtered on his chest, curving around the wound, almost caressing it. But Mickey wasn't the one crying. Without meaning to, and for the first time since their meeting, Percy had broken his promise.
Chapitre 23 Circulation.
A zigzagging trail of shallow prints formed on the sticky sand. They were erratic and barely visible, nearly soundless too. Had Percy relied on his eyes, he would have failed to track the creature. Still, the orange orbs shimmering inside his mana sense made this easy. With a horizontal movement of his upper right arm, he slammed the rod into the critter's side, feeling little resistance as he catapulted its body a dozen meters away. A small crater formed on the ground, as the skin of the fox-like animal regained its color. Careful. There's another behind you, Mickey warned. The young man had already noticed, swinging his left to intercept it. But his movements were clumsy. The only thing he managed to hit was his own back, fumbling with the weapon as the orange blur streaked toward his throat. His bottom left elbow jerked upwards at the last second, the staff's lunge sending the beast flying. It didn't land until a couple seconds later, the impact sending a splash of bloody sand in every direction. The rest of the pack growled at him, but didn't rush to attack, learning from their companions' mistakes as they circled him cautiously. It's harder than you made it look, Percy said. You'll get there, Mickey replied before chuckling. Just don't start crying again. Percy felt his cheeks heat up. Shut up about it already. For all we know it was you. Then, he resumed his stance, his focus returning to his opponents. A sliver of cyan leaked out of his sternum, tracing along an arm to repair one of the rods. Mickey was in charge of their core, as Percy wasn't proficient enough with pure mana to form stable constructs. The second pair of arms too, as the young man didn't need to learn how to use those. Your technique is downright atrocious, but I suppose it would be unreasonable to expect otherwise. If you're used to my body, we can turn things up a notch. Percy nodded. The dance of the savage gods was a complex technique with many moving parts. Mastering each would be a time-consuming process, but a lot of them he could work on by himself. For example, training his body to withstand it was relatively straightforward. Forming the weapons too. That said, there were some aspects he couldn't learn without guidance. Mickey pushed more mana out of their core, flooding their channels. Unlike the last time, he deliberately slowed down the process, making it easier for Percy to follow. The young man paid close attention to the specific pathways the mana was flowing in. Normally, over 95% of a mage's mana was contained in their core. Their channels weren't meant for storage, but for efficiently transmitting it outside as quickly as possible. Consequently, most people only bothered to clear out the channels that began at their sternum and spread out to their extremities. Mickey's technique was very different. It used every channel in one's body, even the seemingly useless ones looping around pointlessly. Percy would have to clear a lot of new pathways later. Not just that, but he'd have to temper all of them, including the ones he normally used, until they could stretch more than normal. This would let him contain twice as much mana as before. The flow was also necessary to keep the mana evenly spread out so that he could draw on it quickly where it was required. The deep breaths too, which would constantly refill his pool, maintaining his strength. Sadly, I can only teach you the first half of the art, as I never learned the rest. What? This is only half. This was news to Percy. Once more, he felt his muscles brimming with strength, as glowing cyan lines became visible on his skin. This much had already allowed Mickey to utterly dominate a previously insurmountable opponent. Just how powerful was the full technique? From what I understand, the last step involves some direct manipulation of ambient mana outside your body. Unfortunately, you'll have to figure it out by yourself. Still, once you master circulation, your strength should shoot up by half a grade. They coughed again, but they didn't bother wiping the blood off their beak this time. There was no point. They were covered all over already. That's enough. I think I've got the basics down. Mickey nodded. With a sudden spin, he delivered a powerful blow on one of the remaining critters, crushing its skull. Then, gathering strength in his calves, he sprung forth like an arrow, swiftly dispatching the last one too. Only after they were alone in the arena did he finally let go of the excess mana, falling with his back on the sand, his chest heaving up and down as the cyan lines faded from his skin. He was using both of his lower hands to keep the wound from opening more than it had to. By now, it had doubled in size and his body was much paler, having lost a ton of blood. "How are you holding up?" Percy asked. He could feel the agonizing pain, of course, but he figured his host had a better understanding of his own body. "I think the next fight will be our last." Perhaps they could have made it a couple days longer if they took things slower, but they'd overexerted themselves against the invisible foxes. Normally, Mickey wouldn't have needed more than a minute to slaughter them all. The only reason he'd persisted for over an hour had been to show Percy the ropes. It wasn't nearly enough time for him to learn the technique, but he'd at least begun to grasp the underlying concepts. As their breath evened out, the young man noticed the crimson sun was still at its apex, having never moved from that very spot. "Are days really long on Huehue?" Mickey raised an eyebrow. "What's a day?" Percy thought he was being pranked. Still, he showed his host images of the sun setting and rising on Remir. "Fascinating," Mickey said after a while. "Huehue always faces Tonitiuh with the same side. The warmth is barely enough for us to survive, but the back of our world is stuck in eternal darkness." Then he chuckled bitterly. "Though I suppose this side isn't much better now." A few moments later, they pushed against the sand, struggling to stand up. Only then did Percy register the crowd's boos, startled by their intensity. Evidently, their bloodthirsty audience wasn't pleased he and Mickey had dragged the fight out for so long. "Not entertaining enough for you, you pigs?" he glared. Mickey shook his head. "You learn to filter it out after a while in here." The rusty gate made a groaning sound somewhere behind them. They looked back, seeing the guards gesturing impatiently. "Percival, do you mind if I do something dumb?" For some reason, the young man felt his heart clench, but didn't say anything. This was Mickey's life, the tiny sliver he had left, and he'd already used up much of it for his sake. Whatever he wanted to do, Percy wouldn't stop him. Receiving a tacit agreement, Mickey ignored the guards' shouts, slowly trudging to the other side of the arena. The boos only grew louder as the injured gladiator stumbled his way to one of the walls. Next, he looked up. Percy examined the crowd as his host's eyes brushed over them. There were people of all ages, men, women and children, dressed in all kinds of clothes he'd never seen before, from sleeveless shirts with silken ties, to colorful dresses that left little to the imagination, to flamboyant hats and intricate accessories. Under other circumstances, he might have appreciated the exotic fashion of Huehue's locals. Right now, however, it wasn't nearly enough to suppress the sheer disgust he felt towards them. Eventually, Mickey's gaze lingered on a man somewhere in the first row. He lacked the tribal tattoos and scars much like everyone else, but, Unlike the rest, his build was muscular. A fighter, Percy realized. He was surrounded by a few more men like him, but Mickey didn't pay them any heed. Raising his hand, he manifested a new cyan rod before pointing it at that person. Only after getting a nod back did he let the construct crumble, his arm falling weakly by his side. Finally, he turned back towards the gate, ignoring the even louder boos buzzing in his ears. The cell's door slammed shut as the guard left with what Percy thought was the equivalent of a sneer. Mind telling me what that was all about? Cusping a handful of water from the puddle, Mickey gulped it sloppily before plopping down on the cold stone. That guy in the stands. He's Mixcoatl, the one who killed me. Percy's eyes widened, but Mickey wasn't done. And I've just challenged him to a rematch. Chapter 24, Mixcoatl. What's up with those people anyway? Aren't they also natives? Why aren't they locked up in a cage? Percy felt his features twist into a grimace. They're just too dumb to see it. Once more, Mickey reached for the kicklet. With a trembling grip, he moved it to his beak, exhaling a soft breath into the instrument. The sound was off tune. He tried again, but his fingers shook, unable to close the holes properly. His lungs hurt with every attempt to. After a few more failures, he let his arm fall, the intricate piece of bone rolling half a circle away. When it became obvious we were going to lose the war, some of our ancestors switched sides. They volunteered the technique and our resources to the enemies, helping them accelerate their conquest. So, the spectators? The guards? The wardens? Percy could already guess the answer. Their descendants. Mickey nodded. The young man pondered over the implications. This certainly explained the bad blood between the two sides. Still, why would that guy agree to a fight? Can you challenge the wardens whenever you want?
Mickey sighed.
There's no official rule allowing or prohibiting it, but why wouldn't he accept? The very reason our enemies even built these colosseums is to humiliate us, and to rub the bitter truth in our faces. What truth? That their ancestors chose right, and mine wrong. The two remained silent for a while. Eventually, Percy spoke again. Can you beat him? Back in the arena, he'd caught a glimpse of Mixcoatl whatever's core. The guy was at yellow, the same grade as them. Sure, Mickey was injured badly. But maybe if he was more skilled. Not a chance, Mickey said. He has the full technique. Even when I was healthy, he won easily. Let alone now. Percy was shocked. Then why challenge him? Not now, I get now. But why did you do it the first time? Same reason, really? Mickey replied. I was running out of time. What do you mean? Mickey closed his eyes, softly tapping the back of his head against the wall. I was born at yellow, some over 80 years ago. Percy raised one of their eyebrows. He didn't know how long a year was on Huehue, but he figured that should be plenty of time for Mickey to have advanced at least once. Yet he hadn't. Of course not. Who would waste precious resources on prisoners? The wardens, on the other hand. Mixcoatl is an orange-born, but he'd already reached yellow by the time he rounded us up, butchering my mother and sister right in front of me, dragging me into this shithole. I'm so sorry, Mickey. Mickey chuckled, but it sounded hollow. I'm not an idiot. I knew I wasn't his match, but I've heard he is close to green now. Unless I went for it when I did, the gap would widen even further, and I'd lose my chance forever. Say what you will, but even throwing my life in the gutter was worth it if I could just land one good hit on that fucker's face. Did you? Mickey raised an eyebrow. Land a hit, Did you? Ha. Nope, Mickey said, clenching his free fists. He toyed with me, gave me a nasty stab, and then he had me sent here to bleed out, and you know the rest. Percy was at a loss for words. But hey, it's not all bad, Mickey said, the skin by the base of his beak curling a touch upwards. Thanks to you, I get to try again. They stood in the arena for the final time. Whatever the outcome of the match, Percy knew his adventure on Huehue was about to end. The horrific wound now extended all the way to Mickey's chest. His flesh barely held together by the lower pair of arms and as much mana as he could spare. His legs wobbled. Even making it out of the long corridor had been a challenge. Percy thought the gate in front of them might have opened, but it was hard to say for sure through their blurry vision. It wasn't until Mickey's opponent stood just a few yards away that they could make out his mocking expression. Their only consolation was that the ringing in their skull made it impossible to hear the crowd's jeers. Percival, whatever happens, I want you to know it was nice having somebody to talk to. Not whatever happens. You have to land a hit, remember? Mickey nodded. Both combatants took a deep breath, standing still for a couple moments. Percy felt power flood through their mana channels, though it hurt this time. Wherever it passed, muscles tore and bones creaked, as blood gushed out of their chest like a river. Bright cyan lines lit up on their opponent's skin as well, as the two sides summoned their weapons. Mickey clenched the ill-shapen rods tightly in his free hands, one threatening to crumble already. Mixcoatl had an easier time, leisurely assuming a loose battle stance, only bothering to lift one of his 4 javelins to point at their throat. Mickey dashed forward. Not that he could afford to move much, but waiting would only make things worse. The twin rods closed into Mixcoatl's face from either side like a pincer, but the attack was too slow, too telegraphed. Too weak. With a swirl of his javelin, the warden sliced both staves in half, kicking Mickey squarely in the chest. Multiple bones broke as his ribcage caved in. Percy felt a wet cough escape their beak as they were sent flying back, skidding and rolling, before sliding on the dirty sand over a long distance. Luckily, their core hadn't shattered under Mixcoatle's foot, but mana still leaked out of their pores as Mickey struggled to keep the technique going. Seeing this, the warden also allowed the glowing lines to fade away. Apparently, he deemed it unnecessary to exert the effort. Just like that, Mickey had been defeated again, this time without Mixcoatle even having to resort to the full dance. Percy felt his soul untangle from his hosts. The makeshift patches he'd hastily fashioned out of soul mana were rapidly coming undone as his connection to Mickey grew more distant. Over the last couple of days, he'd almost forgotten how precarious the condition of their soul was. Like two broken vases, joined together with spit and wishes, it was even more fragile than their physical form. The tether to his main body was already pulling him, trying to pry him out of Hue. No, not like this. Mickey had lived a shitty life, and he died an even shittier death. Percy would be damned if he let him die another. He prodded his mana again, tightening the patches, trying to restore his connection to Mickey, their connection to the battered body. It seemed to work. His buddy's bitter thoughts seeped through him once more, as he barely managed to open their eyes in time to see Mixcoatle looming over them. The warden's beak moved, but Percy couldn't register the words. Then the man lifted his foot and stomped their knee. Hard. Just like that, one of the patches Percy had fixed with so much effort instantly fizzled out, a part of Mickey's soul shattering with it. It was pointless. Even if he clutched onto their fading life for a moment longer, the end would be the same. There was no way Mickey could fight back. So, Percy stopped trying to hold on to their life. Instead, he did something crazier. He didn't have his soul core with him, but this was still his mana. His main body had bestowed it to him to use it as he pleased. It was filled with his will. The young man allowed many of the patches to disperse, ordering the mana to fall in line. There wasn't much of it left. His main body had charged him up with a few refills before sending him off, but most was already gone. Some had been absorbed trying to mend their broken souls. A lot had just leaked out or drifted away. It'll have to do. Mixcoatle was a full grade higher than him, but he wouldn't see this coming. The fool had even disabled the dance. Commanding the mana with all his might, Percy gathered it into one of his lower hands, one of the two still keeping their organs from spilling out of the wound. The young man had spent countless hours practicing this spell, but he wasn't happy with it. It had to be sharper, much sharper, tougher too. He'd only get one shot, and he refused to waste it. The warden lifted his foot again, crushing the other knee. It didn't matter. It was already limp. Percy had already drained all the mana from their lower body, allowing half of Mickey's remaining soul to crumble away. Then Mixcoatle switched to the arms. Luckily, he only bothered with the upper ones. The ones sprawled out on the sand by his sides are not the one Percy needed. 2 seconds later, they were also shattered. With a savage glint in his eyes, the warden raised his javelin, finally done torturing his prey. He pointed the tip at their neck, ready to end this. It was now or never. Percy summoned as much strength as he could and flicked his hand towards the warden's chest. His movement was slow. So slow, Mixcoatle had reacted before the young man even let go of the mana. The warden stabbed Mickey's throat with a javelin. The other 3 crossed in the projectile's path. Percy wasn't sure if the warden could see it. He should be able to, if he was using mana sense. Either way, his hand's motion had betrayed the dagger's trajectory. But it didn't matter. The bastard should have dodged instead. The last thing Percy saw as his vision faded to black were Mixcoatle's eyes glazed over, as he plopped down, deader than dead. Congratulations! You have mastered a new spell. Parting Gift Crude. Chapter 25 Spells. The status was a strange thing. It didn't notify one when they identified their affinity or a bloodline. In fact, it didn't even say a word when their grade advanced. However, there was one thing it did actively inform its user of. Mastering a new spell. The people of Remir weren't sure why it worked like that. For the most part, the status was just a tool of convenience, to help its users keep track of their progress. Still, that didn't explain why spells got special treatment. A widely accepted hypothesis was that it was meant to guide mages into honing their magic. Letting them know when they reached a significant milestone might be a way of doing that. Classifying spells into various ranks could be another. Either way, Percy had waited his whole life for his first crude spell to be announced. He should have been ecstatic to see it finally happen. But he wasn't. In fact, he couldn't care less about that right now. His mind was preoccupied with something more important. Mickey! Can you hear me? We did it. That bastard is dead. Mickey! The young man's time on Hue had been short, but unforgettable. Despite what he'd thought at first, he'd even gained a lot. Mastering his first spell, understanding how his soul clones interacted with dying bodies, learning the fundamentals of the dance. However, Percy would gladly give all that up to talk to his friend one last time. To tell him they'd killed the man who ruined his life. To bid him farewell. But alas, their connection had been severed. His main body already ripping him out of the battered corpse. No. There must be something more I can do. The young man felt for the fallen gladiator's soul. There wasn't much of it left. Just some random pieces here and there. Percy gently wrapped himself around them, enveloping and gathering them like a satchel. He couldn't establish a link with them right now, and the last drop of soul mana had been used up in that attack. His only option was to try and take the shards back to Remir with him. The rope on his back tightened, Percy's soul stretching like a rubber band. Still, Mickey's fragments refused to budge. They were pinned in place, anchoring them both to Huehue still. Just like Percy's soul belonged on Remir, Mickey's belonged here. As broken as it was, its world refused to let it go. Percy felt something tearing, followed by a wave of pure agony. Pulled between two worlds, his own soul wouldn't last long. Shit. At this rate we'll both die. Of course, his main body was probably going to be fine, safe as it was, back in the Avalon House's mansion. That said, permanently losing the clone couldn't be a good thing. Not seeing any way of carrying all the pieces back, Percy loosened his hold on them, letting a couple of the smaller shards slip through the gaps. The dying wisps instantly shattered upon leaving his embrace. His hope was beginning to evaporate when he felt the rest of the pile fidget slightly. It was working, but it wasn't enough. Fuck. I'm sorry, Mickey. Percy left a few more fragments behind, until only a couple remained. His friend's soul now being even tinier than his own. At least, the gamble seemed to pay off, as the young man's desperate move tipped the scales in Remir's favor. The persistent pull finally dislodged them both out of the four-armed corpse, plunging them into an infinite sea of darkness. The pressure on Percy's wisp was immense, his friend's soul feeling heavy in his grasp. Huehue might have lost the tug of war, but it appeared it wasn't quite ready to give up pulling. Is it even worth it? The young man was tempted to let go. What was the point? So little of Mickey remained, he doubted it could be salvaged. But he held on. Even if the odds were abysmal, he had to try. He owed him that much. Percy swung the cyan dagger against the trunk. He only managed to carve about an inch into the aged wood before the mana construct broke apart. Plopping down on the grass, he rested his back against the tree, breathing heavily. He considered refilling his core to try again, but it was dark already and he'd been at it all day. Perhaps he should resume tomorrow. Man, I miss training with my soul mana. Using his second core wasn't as fun. Its lower grade meant he couldn't practice for nearly as long before running out. Furthermore, its lacking affinity made for flimsy constructs that shattered easily. Sadly, his soul mana was still being funneled into his injuries to keep him stable. At least, many of the smaller cracks had already closed, while the rest had shrunk significantly. It was only the massive crater in his chest that looked about the same. Or well, at least he thought it did. Had there been any improvement, it was too small to notice. At this rate, it would take years to fully heal. How long until that clone is done? Around 3 weeks had passed since he activated his ability. On one hand, this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It meant the clone was being productive somewhere out there. Still, it did leave him a bit crippled until he returned. He shook his head. I guess I shouldn't be impatient. Besides, practicing with my second core is something that needs to be done. While it wasn't very useful right now, it would be such a waste to write it off so quickly, especially after all the trouble he'd undergone to repair it. Standing up, he was about to head to his room, when he felt a tug at his chest. He looked down, but there was nothing. Percy frowned, not connecting the dots until a couple moments later. Actively gathering enough mana for soul vision took a while longer, but he got there. Normally, the thread linking him to his clone was invisible even in his augmented sight. However, he could clearly see his soul trembling in unrest as the ethereal cord vibrated. The pull itself wasn't much stronger than it had been just an hour ago. The attraction had been steadily rising over the past 3 weeks. Still, this was the first time he sensed the connection shaking, as if it was attached to a boat sailing in a storm. It's happening. It's coming back. Percy was over the moon. Closing his eyes, he took a few deep breaths, manually gathering some soul mana. It was hard, as his injuries fought to drain it, but he persisted, hoping to fill his core up by the time the clone returned. Naturally, he hadn't a clue how long it would take, or even what state the clone would be in. That said, he guessed it might be handy to have some soul mana available just in case. A good idea it turned out to be. The clone hadn't returned right away. Percy had to wait a few hours even after refilling the core. Annoyingly, he had to keep meditating to keep the mana in. Should I just call it a night? It was tempting. For all he knew, the clone might not arrive until tomorrow. Right when he was seriously considering heading to his room, he felt a powerful impact slam onto his soul, a potent wave of vertigo nearly knocking him off his feet. At the same time, a flood of memories invaded his mind, one after another. A dark expanse, a sea of souls, a fight over a body, a damp cell, a blood-stained arena, an ancient dance, a heartfelt melody, a bitter story, an unlikely victory, a painful death. There was plenty to sift through, but Percy brushed all of it aside, focusing on what mattered. Mickey! Activating soul vision, he fought against the nausea to check his friend's condition. Upon tapping into his core, a lot more soul mana gushed out than he'd intended. Only a trickle flowed to his eyes, the rest pouring into his chest by itself. trying to attach the new chunk back to the rest of his soul. But Percy pressed it back into his core, suppressing his body's instincts. He might need every last drop to save his friend. Examining his chest, he found 3 separate entities at play. One was the main part of his soul, still with a large crater right around his sternum. However, this hole was no longer empty. Inside, there was another piece about the size of a grapefruit, already stuck to the larger section in a few spots. Finally, inside the ball representing his clone, there was a third soul, a foreign one. There wasn't much left, and the pieces were swiftly being assimilated. Crap! I'm going to kill him if this goes on. Back on Huehue, the two had been at an equilibrium. Both souls had been fragmented, though Percy's had his ability to back him up, while Mickey's had quantity and the home advantage. Right now, however, they were in Percy's body, his soul being much healthier and, for the most part, intact. Sporting an overwhelming advantage, the young man watched his own soul gnaw at the last shards of Mickey's, causing it to shrink at an alarming rate. I need to move him elsewhere. It was easier said than done. Percy had already learned that healthy souls tended to reject others. What he needed was a dying body. He looked around with his soul vision still on, though he was alone in the garden. Please, I must find somebody. Fast. Grasping for any idea he could think of, he forced more soul mana into his eyes. He'd never tried this before, but it should work. His soul constructs could phase through walls, so perhaps he could see through them too, right? His guess seemed to be on point, as a few wisps of silver became visible from somewhere inside the mansion. Then he slapped his forehead. That was such a dumb idea. He could scan his house all he wanted, but what were the odds he'd find somebody dying right now? Nobody was on their deathbed as far as he knew. Of course, he wasn't very close to any of them, but he'd have heard something like that. Plus, even on the off chance he found one, what was he going to tell the others? I'm sorry, everyone. I know Uncle Balin is dying and everyone is knee-deep in tears, but can I borrow his body real quick to shove an alien inside? It'll only take a moment. Finding a human body for Mickey was obviously out of the question. Examining his surroundings again, he inspected the critters scurrying about on the grass. Shoving his friend's soul inside a caterpillar would be such a crappy move, but it was all he could think of. Better than a plant, at least. And he did find a few candidates. The training grounds were teeming with ants, worms, ladybugs, butterflies, snails, and all sorts of other not-so-great options. Not many of them were on the verge of death, but that could easily be arranged. The question was whether he could do better. 5 minutes later, Percy noted he was running out of time. Mickey's soul was dissolving into his own, like an ice cube dropped in a cup of tea. The largest body he'd found was a praying mantis. It was healthy, so injuring it just enough would be a little tricky, yet it sounded like his best option at this point. He was about to go for it, when a stroke of inspiration led him to toss one last glance at the tree. There, a faint wisp of silver flickered somewhere atop its naked crown. It was weak, but the young man had a hunch it was worth looking into. Climbing up was a challenge considering his splitting headache and the lack of purchase on the trunk, but he made it there eventually, after an embarrassing fall or two. Reaching the top, he spotted an old bird's nest. It was abandoned. Its owner had either died or forgotten about it. Still, it wasn't empty. Percy counted 6 eggs, 5 of them already dead. In fact, 3 of those were already cracked and hollow. But the last one wasn't fully gone yet. Good enough. Percy didn't exactly know what he was doing. It had taken him ages to figure out how to craft that clone in the first place. Bringing Mickey's soul back to Remir had also been a fluke. Still, he had to try. Stirring his bloodline again, he skipped the whole procedure. He didn't have the time to slowly grow and carve out a proper clone. Luckily, he didn't need to. The last one had just returned, so the grapefruit-sized ball was only loosely attached to its surroundings. The ghostly claw hungrily pounced upon it, snapping it violently from the rest, twisting his and, most importantly, Mickey's souls into one before shooting out of his chest again. This time, Percy was ready for it, having angled his sternum just above the egg. With the last trace of lucidity, he fell backwards, unwilling to crush the nest under his body as he passed out. He didn't know if he had succeeded, or what the repercussions of his reckless move would be, but he'd done his best. Congratulations! You have mastered a new spell. Secret Art. Familiar Crude. Chapter 26, Secret Arts. Percy opened his eyes, a flash blinding him. It soon died down into a mix of colors, but still too blurry to make out much. The off-white of his bedroom wall was predominant, although there was something else by his side. It looked like the silhouette of a person, or maybe just a piece of furniture. He thought he heard them say something. It was muffled, as if they were underwater. The furniture person tried a few more times, with some minor permutations, but Percy still couldn't understand them. Soon, they gave up, disappearing from his sight. His eyes fell shut again. Once more, he faced what he thought was his wall, this time with 2 silhouettes surrounding him. They made more sounds, the first one chirping at a higher pitch than the second. Percy tried to shift but found himself unable to even twitch his fingers. The silhouettes kept speaking to him. At least, that's what he assumed was happening. However, he just couldn't filter them out of the buzz. Tired as he was, he wanted to doze off again, though he forced himself to stay awake. One of the blurs moved, enlarging in his vision. They tugged his chin, the touch prickling him as if he'd been stabbed by needles, before pulling his mouth open. Then, something bland and lukewarm flowed down his throat. It left an aftertaste akin to chicken soup, but it was muted like the rest of his senses. It stopped after a while as they let go of him. The two remained with him, chatting every now and then. It took a while, yet he noticed the figures had grown a bit more defined at some point. One of them, the one with the chirpy voice, was Aquamarine near the top. He recognized it. Her. Elaine. Percy tried muttering her name, but he couldn't even open his mouth without assistance. As for the other blur, well, the only candidates would be Gawain or Archibald, though he wasn't sure who. What happened? Digging through his memories, he tried to recall how he ended up in this state. He remembered training. Lots of training. Practicing with his pure mana hadn't been very pleasant, but it was all he'd been able to do while waiting for something. Right, the clone. He was in the garden when it returned, and then, pain, nausea, panic, frustration, desperation. The clone brought something with it. Something important. No, not something. Someone. He tried to help them. Percy remembered looking around for something. A vessel to place them in. To place Mickey in. Right. Mickey. A gladiator. A teacher. His teacher. His friend. He couldn't find a suitable body. Until he did. Percy climbed a tree, and then, the egg. The memories sobered him up. His vision was still blurry, but he understood now. He remembered. Once more he tried to speak, but his mouth refused to budge. He willed his body to move. Any part of it. He needed to get Elaine's attention. To ask her what happened to Mickey. His finger twitched. Soon the silhouettes shifted too. They must have noticed. Percy. Okay? This time he caught a couple words. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Then, he felt his strength leaving him again. No. I have to tell them first. Talking seemed impossible. His mouth wouldn't open. Percy took his time bludgeoning it into shape. Pushing the air out of his lungs wasn't much easier. He wouldn't get many words out, so he had to choose them carefully. Just two of them. They'd have to do. Care egg. Only after he was certain he saw Elaine nod did he allow himself to pass out again. It took a few more sessions like that until he could properly communicate with his cousin and grandpa. They appeared relieved he'd woken up, but also quite pissed off at him. Percy didn't blame them. He'd gone to great lengths to learn how to use his bloodline safely, yet he tossed all that out of the window by activating it for the second time, not even letting his soul recover first. Right now, he couldn't even examine it, as he was unable to gather a sliver of soul mana. But that was probably for the best. He'd been unconscious for a whopping 3 weeks this time, and was still bedridden now after waking up. Still, he told his relatives of his time on Huehue, of the circumstances that had led him to do something so reckless. In fact, he and Baldy even brought Elaine up to speed on his second core, not seeing much reason to keep it from her. Is the egg all right? He asked. Baldy gestured to his granddaughter to bring something, before speaking. Percy, I found you unconscious in front of a bird nest. Naturally, I assumed those eggs were important to you, even before you told us. His cousin walked to a corner of the room, picking a small object up before returning. Resting atop her hands was a nest made of dried branches, filled with broken eggs and discarded shells. And something else. There was a tiny creature, sleeping soundly in the middle of the nest. A black chick small enough to fit in his palm. This little guy hatched just a couple of days after you passed out. We took care of him ever since. The rest we kept just in case. She explained. Percy nodded, gently picking the bird up. Was this a mistake? He didn't know if there was anything left of his friend in the creature. Even if Mickey was in there, would he appreciate being shoved inside a newborn critter on a distant world? It doesn't matter. Percy shook his head. This wasn't the time for regrets. What was done was done. His priority right now was to make sure it survived. The rest he could figure out later. Doesn't look like it's in great shape, he said. Even after being picked up, it remained asleep. Its breaths were soft and labored. It was better when it hatched, but it's been getting worse. We've been feeding it insects. It improves for a while every time it eats, but it never lasts long. Baldy explained. Waking it up is getting harder. The last time I managed was 2 days ago. His cousin added. Percy furrowed his brow. He wasn't sure where the problem lied. It might be due to its body, as the egg had been abandoned for who knew how long. It should have been on the verge of death too. Otherwise it wouldn't have accepted the soul. Then again, its soul was probably in a sorry state as well. Perhaps even worse than his own. After all, it was a patchwork of 3 different existences. The bird's, Mickey's, and his. And each had been through hell and back by the time they mixed inside the egg. I wish I could use soul vision. It was still impossible to accumulate more than a wisp of mana in his sternum before it got drained. Percy had no idea how long this would last. Perhaps he'd crippled himself for life. The only thing that might shed some light in this situation was his status. Percival Avalon. Mana cores. Mana core 1. Orange. Soul. Mana core 2. Red. Pure. Bloodline. Clone. Create a copy of yourself. Effect varies by affinity. Spells. Parting gift, crude. Secret art. Familiar, crude.
Ew.
Grants access to your status. Grants a bloodline. Grants a second mana core. The only thing that had changed was the new section listing his spells. Percy had nearly forgotten about it. All his efforts in honing his soul constructs coupled with his desperation had culminated in the deadly strike he'd killed Mixcoatl with, though he'd been too busy at the time to celebrate. It was the presence of a second spell that surprised him, however. This one he didn't remember being notified about. Still, it should have happened when he pushed Mickey's soul into the egg. Nothing else made sense. Grandpa, what's a secret art? Baldy raised an eyebrow. Have you created one? Percy nodded, telling them of the new additions to his status. Elaine listened too, clearly interested as well. I see. Well, simply put, a secret art is like a regular spell. The only difference is that it also involves your bloodline. The young man had suspected it was something along those lines. Strictly speaking, what he'd done with the egg wasn't very different from creating a regular clone. Come to think of it, I do feel a connection to Mickey. It was the same kind of sensation his clones and main body experienced, linking them to one another. Though he couldn't observe his soul right now, he didn't need to. Allowing his thoughts to sink into the cord, Percy's eyes widened as a new status page manifested in his vision. Mictlantecuhtli, Percival's Familiar. Chapter 27 Beast Affinity. Mictlantecuhtli, Percival's Familiar. Mana Cores. Mana Core 1. Red. Beast. Mana Core 2. Seed.
Ew. Hey.
Fractured. Grants the seed of a second mana core. Requires potent life and mind mana to germinate. There was a lot to unpack there. Seeing the familiar had inherited his friend's name gave him some relief. With any luck, it meant Mickey was indeed buried somewhere inside the bird. Well, it was also possible it meant nothing. Perhaps the status had simply picked that name out of convenience, as that was how Percy thought of the creature. Hopefully it's the former. Another thing that caught his eye was how his prolific second core had spread out once more, though it was back to fractured again, for some reason. By now, he was pretty sure this thing was glued to his soul. After all, his soul was the only thing he'd brought back from the Moirai. However, it seemed to have more components to it as well. Perhaps one rooted in his body and one in his mind, explaining the two other types of mana needed to repair it. Once he had, his mind followed his soul to Huehue, which was why his clone had only lacked the life part. But now, his mind didn't seem to be present in the familiar, downgrading it by another step. In any case, this is a project for the future. The next thing he noted was that the mysterious section with the question marks was missing two of the usual culprits. It wasn't that strange the small critter didn't have a bloodline, but Percy was surprised it didn't have a status either. Then how am I reading it right now? The only answer he could come up with was that Mickey's status was currently just an extension of his own, which he could view through their connection. Well, any idea what's wrong with it? Baldy asked, snapping him out of his thoughts. Percy shook his head. There wasn't enough information to identify the problem. That said, he did have an idea on how to solve it. Have you tried feeding it anything bigger than insects? It's a newborn chick. What else could it eat? Elaine asked back. He doesn't mean the meat, just the cores. Baldy explained to his granddaughter before turning to Percy. It has the beast affinity, I imagine? The young man nodded. They wouldn't be needing any tests to confirm that. Every non-sentient animal in the universe had the beast affinity by default. Beast mana was unique in that it couldn't normally leave one's body, rendering its owners incapable of casting spells. However, that didn't make it weak. In fact, it was the opposite. It had the unique property of strengthening its users to such an extent they could compete against mages of the same grade with nothing but brute force. And this was just the start. This affinity gave animals another colossal advantage that made sentient races envy them greatly. They could advance naturally, without having to resort to things like expensive elixirs. Beast mana was great at consuming and assimilating other mana types, which meant its users could evolve extremely quickly simply by hunting and devouring others. Had it not been for their general lack of intelligence, beasts might have become the dominant force in the cosmos. Well, there was also the fact that each promotion required a ton of food, which wasn't exactly sustainable. For example, merely to advance from red to orange required the consumption of hundreds of red cores. This made blue and violet beasts extremely rare. As for white, Percy doubted there were any on Remir. Still, the young man didn't care about Mickey's bright future prospects right now. Hearing the bird improved whenever it ate made him think better quality food might be the answer. After all, insects had brown cores, a special grade below even red. It was exclusive to them, as larger creatures couldn't survive with something that weak. Perhaps what Mickey needed were a few red cores. It's not like I haven't considered it, though I don't think the issue is a lack of mana. Baldy said. But we can give it a shot if you want. Percy insisted. He didn't necessarily disagree with his grandpa's assessment, yet it wasn't like they had a better option. Elaine opened the door, entering Percy's room. Suspended above her hand was a bubble of water, with something squirming inside. It was a mouse, clawing desperately to escape its liquid prison. Unfortunately for it, its efforts weren't going to bear fruit today. Still, Elaine had made sure its head was above the surface, to avoid drowning the animal a minute too soon. It had taken her a couple of hours to procure Mickey's meal. The Avalon house had no shortage of meat, but mana cores tended to crumble away and dissipate shortly after one's death. They needed a fresh kill for the bird. I'm sorry it took a while. I had to search the fields for ages to find one. A powerful green cord mage could naturally capture vermin rather easily, but that was precisely why there weren't any inside the mansion. Come on, buddy. You need to eat, the young man said. Percy had been told it was getting harder to wake the bird up, but he hoped to get through to it via their connection. Focusing on the ethereal cord as he gently spoke to his friend seemed to work after a few attempts. The chick moved its head groggily. It needed help standing up. Elaine lowered the glowing bubble into Percy's other palm as the young man brought his hands together. The girl tightened the sphere, snuffing the life out of the mouse, closing her eyes in the process. Percy knew she didn't like doing it, which only made him appreciate her help more. Then, she pulled the mana away from the rodent, tossing the splash of water aside as the tiny corpse landed in front of Mickey. Percy rolled the body over with his thumb, pointing at the animal's sternum. After some more prodding, the bird finally pecked at it, causing Elaine to look away again. Even Percy wrinkled his nose in disgust, though he didn't avert his gaze. Instead, he activated Mana Sense, unwilling to miss anything important. With his sixth sense, he followed the orb of red as it rolled down the bird's throat, swiftly dissolving in its stomach. A gush of mana soon flowed through Mickey's body, causing him to perk up before resuming his meal with more vigor. It does seem to do something, Baldy said. Percy nodded, still observing his friend, relieved to see his condition improve however briefly. He and Archibald kept watching the bird, both raising their eyebrows as it continued getting better with each peck. Mickey couldn't possibly eat more than a third of the carcass in one sitting and, even then, it would take him a while to finish. Naturally, each bite was no larger than a grain of rice. Yet, for some reason, the mana never stopped spreading out of the familiar stomach. What's going on? Percy asked. Most of the mana should have been inside the mouse's core. Where's the rest coming from? His grandpa appeared just as perplexed as he was. Each bite gave Mickey less mana than that first one, but still not nearly as little as they would have expected. Meanwhile, the bird's mood greatly improved, as the familiar pecked more and more frequently, like his life depended on it. Don't tell me? Percy's eyes widened as he harbored a guess. It was only a couple minutes later that Mickey's condition stopped improving. The bird was still eating gluttonously, but the meat had stopped releasing mana at some point. We're going to need more mice, Percy said, flashing his cousin a sheepish grin. Please tell me this is the last time I'm doing this. Elaine spoke with a grimace. Percy scarcely registered his cousin's words. His attention focused on the floor. There, Mickey was skidding around happily, having already finished eating another 2 mice, currently heading towards the third. Well, finished might not be the best word, as the bird seemed to grow disinterested in each carcass after a minute or two, consuming less than a tenth of the meat. Only after his third victim stopped providing him any mana did Mickey pause. This time, he wasn't in a rush to reach the next one either. I think he's full, Baldy said. Mickey, I know you're stuffed, but can you keep going? Just one more. The young man pleaded through their connection. The bird tilted its head in confusion. Percy wasn't sure if it had understood his instructions. Maybe it just didn't get why it had to continue eating when it wasn't hungry. Still, it listened after a moment, walking to the fourth mouse, though its steps were clearly a touch less eager than earlier. Like before, some mana was soon released inside Mickey's stomach, flowing through his channels, filling his body. Unlike before, however, the bird's frame was already saturated, rendering it unable to absorb any more. The familiar looked unwell, as if he was about to be sick, having no outlet for the excess. The red glow rose up his throat and towards his beak, about to spill out, when Mickey stubbornly held it in, unwilling to throw up his food. Yet more mana manifested in his stomach, mounting up the pressure, making Percy stare at his friend in alarm. That's enough. Just let it go. The young man was about to stop him, when something strange made him swallow his words. For seemingly no reason, a chunk of the excess mana instantly vanished from Mickey's body, as a subtle flow trickled through their connection. It wasn't much, but Percy recognized it, his eyes widening. Soul mana. Chapter 28, A Peculiar Diet. There was no mistaking it. The excess mana spilling out of Mickey was soul mana. They hadn't been able to identify it earlier because Mana Sense couldn't differentiate between various affinities. The only thing that determined its appearance in that case was purity and density, in other words, its grade. That was why everything had appeared red previously. Only with soul vision could Percy have noticed the difference. Right, soul vision. The young man tried to tap into the trickle sent over by his familiar, to direct it to his eyes, but his broken soul quickly snatched it too. Keep going, Mickey. Eat. He did catch the strange looks Elaine and Baldy gave him, but he didn't say anything. He could explain later. Heeding his request, the bird dove back into the mouse's flesh, as Percy took a deep breath, and then another, trying to refill his first core. The mana regenerated slowly at first, but soon another stream flowed through the cord, Mickey having discovered how to relieve himself of the excess pressure already. It took all of Percy's willpower to gather enough in his eyes, but he managed to augment his sight at last. As soon as soul vision activated, he tossed a quick glance down his own soul, saying it was a mess wouldn't do it justice. The crater in his chest had greatly expanded. As for the rest, it almost resembled minced meat, held together by numerous thin threads. No wonder I can barely even stand. He shook his head. The priority right now was to figure out what Mickey was doing. Turning to his familiar, he saw his soul wasn't much better. It was made of 3 distinct pieces that had been hastily twisted together like a yarn ball. At least, his body was filled to the brim with soul mana, which constantly latched onto the damaged soul to mend it. Of course, it would take ages for it to be fully repaired at this pace, but this was promising. Next, his attention shifted to Mickey's beak. His soul was gathered there, sharpening the edges, making them glint in Percy's soul vision. It reminded the young man of the daggers he constructed with his soul mana. Every time the bird pecked at the dying embers of the mouse's soul, a chunk of glowing silver slid down its throat along with the flesh, dissolving into soul mana in its stomach. The sight of the hatchling gleefully devouring another soul, as if it was little more than kibble, sent a chill down Percy's spine. Wow, how is he even doing this? His best guess was that Mickey's nature as a familiar had bled into his instincts as a beast, giving rise to this frightening ability. Either way, Percy knew at this moment that this would be the key to repairing both of their souls. "I'm going to throw him," Percy yelled. He was sitting on a branch, holding a bird with both hands. The bird was naturally Mickey, who had grown twice as large as before, his feathers a slick black, absorbing the sunlight like uncut onyx. "Go for it. I've got him," Elaine replied. She stood below him, an azure net fluttering in the air in front of her. Rather than rope, it seemed to be made of numerous interlocking streams of glowing water. Upon receiving a positive reply, the young man tossed the bird up. It fell rapidly, sending waves of panic through their connection. "Caw, you've got this," Percy sent back. Betrayed by its only family, the bird had no option but to frantically flap its wings in a desperate attempt to right itself. At first, its movements were clumsy. Still, just a couple of feet before hitting the net, its speed seemed to slow, as its direction shifted slightly, letting it glide over the net, landing softly on the ground a few meters away. "Caw, caw." Percy smiled as he saw his companion turn back his direction, giving him what was probably intended as a furious glare. Still, he could tell through their link the cute look contained more pride than anger. Show off. It had been a month since they discovered Mickey's ability. For the first week, Percy had relied on his cousin to bring food for the bird, as he had personally been too weak to walk. A dozen meals later, however, both their conditions had improved significantly. By then, Percy was able to move around on his own, allowing him to take care of his friend by himself. Every morning since then, Percy went on a stroll a couple miles away from the mansion, with Mickey perched on his shoulder. The young man used those opportunities to stretch his legs, while simultaneously setting all sorts of mouse traps and rabbit snares in the surrounding fields, collecting the previous day's haul in the process. Then, he fed his familiar for an hour or two, as they both used the influx of soul mana to hasten their recovery. "We should head back. Grandpa is waiting for us," Elaine said. Percy nodded. Today was the day he'd been looking forward to for a while now. He'd finally recovered enough to add another important item to his daily routine. The two returned to Archibald's office where they found their grandpa dressed in training robes. He gestured them to follow him, as he led the teenagers to a spacious room somewhere inside the mansion. They had chosen this location over the outdoors training grounds as privacy was paramount for what they planned to do. Next, both Baldy and Elaine looked at Percy expectantly. After all, he was going to be their teacher during these sessions. The young man cleared his throat, assuming the role of a sagely scholar as his relatives rolled their eyes. "So, the first thing we need to do is straightforward strength training to push our bodies to their limits." Without waiting for them, he dropped to the floor, beginning a set of push-ups. Baldy and Elaine didn't say anything, joining him just a moment later. Of course, a simple workout wasn't nearly demanding enough for the powerful mages. To truly challenge themselves and benefit from the training, each of them had strapped weights all over their bodies, raising the intensity of the exercises sharply. Obviously, Baldy's were by far the heaviest, as he lifted a couple tons with each repetition. Even Elaine's were no joke at a couple 100 kilos. Meanwhile, Percy's were much more modest by comparison. Either way, if it hadn't been for the numerous runes glowing on the floor, he was sure the wooden planks would have collapsed under the pressure, the commotion drawing the attention of the rest of his family. A lot of silencing wards covered the walls too. About an hour later, all three were lying on their backs, breathing heavily, their bodies drenched with sweat. Naturally, the trio were here to practice the dance of the savage gods, or at least the parts that Mickey had been able to show him back on Huehue. Percy could have kept the powerful art to himself, of course, but there were many reasons why he'd chosen to share it. Firstly, both Elaine and Archibald had done a lot for him, so he decided to bring something back for them even before sending out that clone. Secondly, as much as Percy wished he were strong enough to survive on Remier on his own, he understood he currently had no choice but to hide under his house's insignia. For the time being, his safety hinged entirely on Baldy's ability to defend their family from their enemies. Consequently, helping his grandpa grow stronger would benefit them all. Finally, Percy actually needed his grandpa's help once again, to practice the technique more efficiently. Ready to resume? The young man asked. Physical training essentially involved breaking down and repairing one's muscles. Humans could only exercise for a few hours per day, lest they injured themselves, doing more harm than good. At least, that was the case if one didn't have a grandpa with a life affinity and a violet core healing them. All right, Baldy said. The young man felt an intense pressure radiating out of his grandpa's core, as a wave of vibrant green flashed through the room. A few seconds later, his muscles stopped burning, his stamina having fully recovered. He didn't even hesitate before restarting his workout anew. It was tough, of course, but the memory of the wounded gladiator's savage dance kept him going. Chapter 29 Mana Channels. Please tell me we're done for today. Elaine groaned. The trio were sitting on the floor, Baldy having already healed them for the dozenth time that day. We might as well stop here. I can help us recover again, but we still need to eat properly to build muscle, Archibald said. Elaine didn't even wait for the second part before waving her hand, manifesting 3 bubbles of water in the air. Each was about twice the size of a watermelon. They flew over their heads as she let go, the blobs soon splashing on their bodies. Sniffing a couple of times, she scrunched up her nose. Remind me to bring soap tomorrow, she said, already pushing herself up. Is there anything else we need to be doing? Baldy asked. Yes, Percy nodded. Try to spend a couple hours every night clearing your mana channels. Any specific ones? Nope. We need all of them. Only after our bodies have stopped improving and all our channels are cleared and tempered to their limit can we move to the next step. The others nodded in agreement. Percy had already explained the details of the technique before, so nobody felt like complaining. They all understood what a bargain they had struck. As Percy was about to leave the room, he crouched to pick Mickey up from the floor. The bird gave them strange looks after spending all day watching them train. The young man had brought the familiar along as he wasn't comfortable leaving him alone just yet. You're the one who taught me this stuff, buddy. I promise I'll do everything I can to help you remember it one day. Percy was resting on his bed, looking up at the ceiling. It felt nice his training was finally back on track. His reckless move with Mickey had cost him a lot of time, though he didn't regret it. I'd do it all again, he thought as he looked at the bird sleeping soundly on a cushion, in a corner of the room. Even if Percy put his friend's well-being aside and looked at everything from a pragmatic perspective, his gamble would probably pay off in the long term. Mickey's potential was difficult to quantify. Right now, he was young and his core only at red, but with a beast affinity he would outgrow Percy in no time. The young man wouldn't be surprised if his familiar became his secret weapon at some point. Sure, his stunt had set him back by a few months, as he'd been unable to begin practicing the dance before now. Not just that, but his soul core was still out of order. He couldn't use it or even feed it elixirs, and it would be a while until he could send out another clone. But, all things considered, the benefits probably outweighed the costs. I guess teaching him how to hunt by himself should be one of my priorities. Right now, Percy had to spend a few hours each morning helping the bird out. It was terribly inefficient as they only moved as fast as he could walk, and his traps only caught a handful of meals each day. If Mickey could fly around looking for food by himself, he would probably do much better. It would not only accelerate their soul's recovery but also the familiar's advancement to orange. Plus, it would free up more of Percy's time to spend on his own magic. That's tomorrow's problem though. For now, let's focus on clearing some channels. He sat cross-legged, closing his eyes. Stirring the core in his abdomen, he pulled some mana to his arm. It flowed around his abs and then below his pectoral muscle before turning downwards at his shoulder. It was easy to think of mana channels as magical veins, as the former facilitated the circulation of mana, much like the latter did with blood. Still, the analogy wasn't quite correct as mana channels weren't physical tubes. It might be more accurate to describe them as the path of least resistance for the mana. Clearing a pathway involved using it repeatedly, wearing down all the obstructions over time to make the flow smoother. This meant one's mana channels differed depending on their affinity. After all, each type had different properties subtly affecting how it flowed through the body. Consequently, the path of least resistance for, say, fire mana wasn't necessarily the same as that for air mana and so on. For most people, it didn't really matter. So, what if their mana channels looked slightly different to one another's? They could still clear them and use their magic all the same, right? But it does affect me. Percy had 2 cores with different affinities. This meant he also had 2 entirely separate sets of mana channels. Even if he cleared all his pure pathways, he would have to do it again later for his soul ones. Not just that, but his soul affinity introduced another challenge the others wouldn't have to deal with. Most affinities interacted with one's body, meaning the corresponding mana flowed through it. Percy's soul mana, however, flowed through his soul instead. Can I even use the dance with it? How would I strengthen my soul enough to do that? He shook his head. This was a problem for after he was done repairing it. Right now, he could focus on mastering it for his second core. Returning his attention to the flow on his arm, he cut it off at the shoulder, instead diverting it towards his other shoulder. It now had to pass parallel to his collarbone, curving through the space between his spine and lungs. The mana resisted at first, as it wasn't used to traveling along this route. Normally, when Percy wanted to shift mana from one arm to the other, he'd send it through his core first. This is more efficient. It wasn't just about increasing his capacity. This was simply a faster way to move it through his body. Most people didn't bother, as the channels they normally used were only a fraction of the total. They didn't consider this minor speed-up significant enough to waste months opening the additional pathways. Though clearly, this mindset was wrong. It had blinded everyone to the possibilities Mickey's people had stumbled upon. Percy was broken out of his concentration by the gentle rays of the morning sun seeping through the window, brushing softly along his face. Shit, don't tell me I was up all night. So focused had he been on clearing his channels that he'd lost track of time. At least, he'd discovered and opened over a dozen new ones. Still, plenty remained in his body. Maybe it's not too late for a short nap. Caw, caw. Guessing his thoughts, Mickey, who'd woken up already, flapped his wings angrily as he leapt on the bed. Fine. We'll go get your breakfast. Just let me drink my elixir first. Percy uncorked the elegant vial, gulping its contents in one go. He began the daily ritual of cycling his pure mana between his stomach and core as he fought to keep his eyes open. He sure wasn't looking forward to another 12 hours of physical training with Baldy after an all-nighter. Caw. Right. I'm awake, the young man said, having totally fallen asleep at some point. Getting up, he opened the door, dragging his feet outside the mansion. The morning breeze gave him goosebumps. It wasn't pleasant, but at least the chill and the fresh air helped flush the last traces of sleep out of his system, leaving only the exhaustion behind. Mickey jumped onto his shoulder, content with enjoying his free ride as Percy prepared his food for him. That's when the young man paused, flashing the bird a mischievous grin. Starting from today, you'll be flying alongside me, looking for more mice. His familiar tilted its head, playing dumb, but Percy knew Mickey understood him. Caw, caw. The bird continued to protest, but Percy refused to take another step until it began pulling its own weight. It took another 10 minutes of arguing, but Mickey eventually took off, resigned to his fate. He hadn't stopped mouthing off what Percy could only assume were curses though. Only then did the young man resume his stroll, gathering some pure mana in his hand, trying to form it into a solid shape. This was pretty much the only time he had during the day to practice his magic, so he wouldn't waste it. He might have been born at red, but now he'd finally accumulated a few advantages of his own. Unlike his peers who only had a single core to worry about, he essentially had 4 between himself and his familiar. He couldn't afford to slack. Percy sighed. I suppose I'll just have to work 4 times as hard then. Chapter 31 Year. Mickey sent an image of a shadow sneaking through the bushes. He was perched atop a branch, gazing at their surroundings from the high vantage point, scouting the area. The crow was already fully grown by now. Percy felt it practically salivating through their bond as it eyed their misguided ambushers. Thanks. I see them now. Percy pulled most of his mana to his channels, nearly emptying his core before taking a deep breath to refill it. The motes spiraled into his lungs like a vortex, as an even denser river gushed through his body. But he wasn't done yet. He pumped even more mana through his pathways, feeling them swell and burn, his muscles brimming with strength, his frame threatening to pop like a pufferfish. An arrow shot out from behind him. The young man only tilted his head slightly, dodging the projectile as the wind brushed harmlessly by his ear. Another mouthful of mana later, he saw faint cyan lines glow under his skin. The pattern wasn't exactly the same as Mickey's. Even though they shared their affinity, their cores were located at different points, forcing Percy to modify the technique slightly. They shone less brightly too. There was definitely some room for improvement, but the status had still been kind enough to register the technique a couple months back. You chose the wrong guy to attack. Percy smirked. Then he stomped hard, his foot making a loud sound as it cracked the dry dirt, catapulting him towards the goblins. More arrows flew his way, but he easily weaved out of their path, causing the goblins' eyes to widen. They switched to their melee weapons in a hurry. Their knives and hatchets had all been crafted out of bone. Rather poorly too. Percy's core had nearly refilled already, but he drained it again, this time gathering the mana into his right hand, squishing the blob of cyan into something solid. By the time he reached his opponents, his weapon had fully formed. It was a staff about as tall as he was, its thickness the same as his thumbs. He spun it through the air as his momentum carried him between 2 of the creatures, where he hit each with a different end of the staff, slamming one to the ground while sending the other flying. Of the remaining 5 goblins, only 3 were brave enough to gang up on him, as the other 2 fled in terror. Still, their lunges felt slow in his mana sense. He easily tiptoed around their attacks with some well-placed footwork. He swung his weapon again. It had cracked after the previous attack, his red core not doing him any favors. But he'd already finished repairing it as the mana continued to accumulate inside his body. 2 swings later, 3 more goblins were rolling on the ground, as Percy finally allowed the staff to crumble. Another image flashed through the connection. Mickey had already intercepted one of the escapees, having torn out its throat with his talons. The bird was currently feasting on the goblin's soul, as Percy felt the mana flowing through the link. Activating soul vision, he spotted the last of the creatures. It had stopped moving, crouching quietly behind a tree some 30 yards away. Perhaps it thought it was safer to hide than run. Big mistake. Percy took another breath, this time focusing on his first core instead. The two sources of soul mana soon gave him just enough for the spell as a silver dagger formed in his hand. With a flick of his wrist, the parting gift pierced soundlessly through the air, doing so even more rapidly than the arrows had, before phasing through the tree's trunk. A moment later, the goblin's stiff body landed on the ground. Start with the dead one before its soul dissipates. Percy tossed the corpse in front of his familiar, who just finished consuming the previous goblin. The other 5 were merely knocked out, as the young man had taken extra care to keep them alive. Feeling the mana in his eyes dissipating, he hurriedly tossed one last glance down at his soul before soul vision deactivated. Mickey had supplied him more than enough to keep it active for longer if he wanted, but he'd rather invest the limited resource towards their recovery. His soul didn't look that great, still resembling a pile of minced meat held together by thin threads. That said, the chunks were fewer and larger than before, and they were attached to one another more firmly too. The crater in his chest had also shrunk a lot since last year. That's right. A little over a year had passed since Mickey's first flight. Percy had even had 2 birthdays in that time. He was 17 now. He still couldn't gather much soul mana without the bird's assistance, but he healed faster and faster as Mickey grew up and their hunts became more rewarding. As early as a few months ago, the two had graduated from rats and rabbits, turning their sights towards the goblins in the nearby Whistling Woods. It wasn't ideal, as the forest was a few miles away from his house's mansion. It meant they had to spend several hours per day just traveling back and forth. But it couldn't be helped, as it was too dangerous to camp the night there by themselves, and they harbored a few too many secrets to be working with strangers. Neither Baldy nor Elaine had the time to babysit them for weeks on end. That said, it wasn't all bad. Percy's free time had increased sharply ever since his training sessions with his relatives stopped, so he could afford to do this. Plus, hunting was good for honing both his magic and his teamwork with Mickey. Finally, even though the goblins were notoriously difficult to find, their larger cores and much more developed souls made the endeavor worthwhile. At least Mickey is doing better. While Percy's soul was still some distance from a full recovery, preventing him from cleansing his first core or sending another clone, his familiars had grown a lot more stable. The bird could even go a few days without a meal before it began to get affected. Shrugging, the young man's attention turned to his status, as he had no interest in watching his friend stuff his face with goblins. Percival Avalon. Mana Cores. Mana Core 1. Orange. Soul. Mana Core 2. Red. Pure. Bloodline. Clone. Create a copy of yourself. Effect varies by affinity. Spells. Parting Gift, crude. Secret Art. Familiar, crude. Quarterstaff, crude. Circulation, refined. Grants access to your status. Grants a bloodline. Grants a second mana core. Not much had changed, besides the 2 new spells he'd registered. The first, Quarterstaff, was perhaps the most unassuming entry in his entire status. Being nothing more than a crude spell cast from a red core with a pure affinity, it wasn't nearly as eye-catching as all the other stuff in there. Still, Percy was proud of it, as it had taken him a lot of hard work to hone it to its current state. Plus, it was his very first registered spell with his second core, so that had to count for something. At first, the young man had tried to go for a couple of shorter rods, one in each hand, to more closely mirror Mickey's style. Eventually, he realized dual wielding felt a bit unnatural to him. He appeared to have a personal proclivity towards a single, longer weapon. The construct wasn't very sturdy, but it was good enough for the goblins. The other new entry was a lot more impressive, however. Although still a step short of the full dance, Circulation was Percy's first refined spell. As a mage's grade increased, so did their mana capacity and regeneration, as well as their control and reflexes, allowing them to master more intricate spells. Generally, people between red and yellow mostly focused on crude spells, whereas refined spells were seen as the hallmark of greens and blues. There were exceptions, of course. Sometimes, a talented yellow would master a refined spell ahead of time, or a lazy green would fail to do so before advancing. Still, Percy was only at orange. Not just that, but he was technically using circulation with his red core. Suffice to say, his circumstances were essentially unprecedented. News of his achievement would probably cause some waves if they leaked. He wasn't exactly surprised circulation was ranked that highly either, as it involved many difficult and demanding steps to master. Frankly, he knew he couldn't have done this without cheating extensively. His grandpa's help had allowed him to get the equivalent of half a decade of physical training in only half a year. That, coupled with his dedication in clearing his channels, meant he had started tempering his pathways faster than the others. In addition, the final step, circulating the mana and overcharging both his core and his channels, was by far the most difficult. However, he'd already experienced the art under Mickey's guidance, severely lowering the barrier of entry for him. Even Baldy hadn't mastered the spell until a month after Percy. As for Elaine, she was still struggling with the last part. Let's not get complacent, though. They can still wipe the floor with me with their hands tied behind their back. Percy sighed. At least, he'd grown strong enough to survive by himself at a semi-dangerous place like the Whistling Woods. That said, The road ahead was long and uphill. Suddenly, some unexpected thoughts seeped through the link, drawing his attention. The young man lifted his eyes, looking at his familiar with concern. For some reason, the bird had stopped eating after the third goblin. It was sitting on the ground, occasionally twitching, as if in pain. Mickey, what's wrong? No reply. Percy activated Mana Sense, anxious to figure out what was happening to his bond. The bird's frame was glowing more brightly than ever before, its entire silhouette shimmering in a vibrant red color. More and more mana was released from its stomach, as its flesh shook and squirmed. The core in Mickey's sternum thrummed more frequently and violently than he'd ever seen it do before, glowing a shade brighter than the rest of his body. Logically, his friend should have already started sending him the excess mana to relieve himself. However, he was instead holding everything in for some reason, letting it accumulate to a dangerous level. The young man panicked, unsure how to help his familiar. He was about to call to him again to ask him to let go of the mana, when he caught something odd through his sixth sense, giving him pause. As the core pulsed more and more intensely, its color shifted. It was subtle at first, but Percy became more and more sure of what was going on as he kept watching. His previous fear was now replaced by excitement and even anticipation. Mickey was advancing to Orange. Chapter 31, Leaving the Nest. Mickey complained loudly, much to Percy's dismay. The bird's screeches were far more piercing than ever before, echoing through the dark forest.
I'm sorry, Bobby.
You're too big to sit on my shoulder now. The actual advancement had taken less than an hour, but that was just the start. Saying the crow was starving afterwards would be the understatement of the century. Mere minutes after the promotion, Mickey had devoured all 7 goblins, not leaving a single bone behind. In fact, he ate their weapons too. Gone were the days when he only selectively sampled his victims' souls and cores, leaving most of their flesh untouched. Evidently, the bird's advancement had placed its body in a state of rapid mutation, requiring a ton of nutrients in a short period of time. Percy had watched his friend grow visibly with each bite as they scoured the forest, looking for anything even remotely edible. The two had remained in the Whistling Woods all night, desperately fueling Mickey's insatiable appetite. It wasn't until the first rays of sunlight pierced through the dense thicket that the bird seemed to be done eating, its frame now twice as large as before. Oh well, I bet he's a lot stronger. Other than his size, Mickey's appearance hadn't changed much. The only other notable differences were his beak and talons being even sharper than before. Their edges now glinted in a pale silver light, even outside soul vision. Percy sure pitied whoever ended up on the receiving end. Overall, the most welcome surprise was the improvement to his familiar soul, however. It had stabilized a lot even before the promotion, but this new step took everything to a whole new level. Mickey's soul was still an assortment of multiple parts, but they'd grown closer together. The delineation separating the 3 souls was much fainter, resembling old scars more than fresh wounds. Maybe they'll fuse completely after another evolution or two. Either way, the bird would not only harvest more soul mana from its victims, but it would also need a lot less for itself, sending the lion's share to Percy. Like this, he was optimistic he'd fully recover in a couple months. Then he smiled wryly. Not everything was good news. He'd already felt the two had outgrown the Whistling Woods for a while now. To fully take advantage of Mickey's improvements, they'd need to leave the safety of the mansion and venture to more dangerous regions. And there was another, more immediate problem. How do we explain you? He frowned, looking at his pal flying circles above him as he stepped out of the dense undergrowth. Before, they'd used the excuse he'd found Mickey abandoned and raised him as a pet. It wasn't that strange, as red beasts were essentially regular animals. Reaching Orange, however, not only made them stronger, but far more aggressive. The thrill of advancement whetted their appetite, making them all but impossible to tame. Suffice to say, his relatives would be asking a lot of questions if they returned home like this.
Okay.
Remember to stay away until I say otherwise. Percy imparted the same instructions for the 5th time as they neared his family's estate. Cra. Mickey protested but didn't disobey, taking off to look for a snack or something. The young man made his way to the mansion, heading straight to Baldy's office before knocking at the door. Come in. Percy stepped inside, ready to deliver the news, when he noticed somebody else in there. He was a black-haired man who looked to be in his early 20s, dressed in an elegant buttoned-up shirt and silken trousers. His core was blue. He was Galahad, Archibald's oldest living child currently in the family, a yellow-born over 400 years old House Avalon's second-in-command, only below Baldy himself. In fact, he was the one who had the highest chance of reaching Violet, on track to do so in about a century. Don't you think you've been wasting too much of Father's time, boy? Galahad asked, his nose wrinkling in disgust. Percy grimaced but didn't reply. Instead, he turned to his grandpa. I was hoping to speak to you alone. It's urgent. Don't ignore me, you brat, his uncle snapped. You should be grateful we've wasted so many elixirs on you already. I still don't get what your grade has to do with passing your affinity. He looked about to keep going, but Baldy raised his hand. That's enough, Galahad. I don't need you to manage my schedule for me, or to tell me which of my grandkids to spend time with. Archibald's tone was calm but firm. Galahad raised an eyebrow. He probably hadn't expected his father would reprimand him in front of the likes of Percy. He only spared the young man a cold glance as he walked out of the office, though Percy didn't miss his uncle's clenched fists, drained of color. I almost forgot what a bastard he was. Between his injuries, his training and his ventures into the forest, Percy hadn't run into his relatives as much over the past year. His amiable relationship with Elaine and Archibald had shifted his overall perspective on his family, but the truth was most of them still looked down on Redbournes like him. That much hadn't changed. "What is it?" Baldy asked, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Right," Percy exclaimed before approaching the desk. He covered his mouth before whispering, "Mickey has advanced." Archibald's eyes widened. "Already? This is even faster than I expected. What do we do? I can't exactly bring him here." His grandpa sank back into his chair, remaining silent for a few minutes. Eventually, he spoke. "We're heading back to the forest. It's a temporary solution, but I'll stay there with you for a week until we come up with something more permanent." A grimace marred Percy's face. By the time he met Baldy, he'd already been up for nearly 30 hours, having spent all night hunting with Mickey. Staying awake as his grandpa arranged for his impromptu absence had been pure torture, and the young man wasn't happy traveling to the woods again. Still, this had to be done if he was to keep his secrets. He doubted anybody in his family was a spy or traitor, but there were hundreds of people in the Avalon house. If a few more learned of his second core or Mickey, it wouldn't be long before that number doubled, and then quadrupled until the entire mansion knew. And then, it would only take a mistake for the rest of Remier to find out too. In fact, those two secrets were still relatively benign. Anything pertaining to the dance, on the other hand, was far more dangerous. Even in its incomplete state, it could instantly raise the strength of an entire house by half a step, placing them right behind the great houses. As much as it would benefit his family if they all learned it, a single mishap could easily invite disaster. Just like what happened to Mickey's people. Consequently, Baldy had strongly emphasized to him and Elaine the importance of keeping everything under wraps. As much as it sucked to be looked down on by people like Galahad, knowing he could change everyone's view of him with a few words, Percy understood what a thin line he was treading. "Percy, I'm sorry you have to take all this shit from everyone," Baldy said as he walked alongside him, a dozen of his clones marching silently right behind them. "Truth be told, you've already done more for our family than almost anyone else." The young man waved the apology away. "We knew it would be like this since the beginning." Archibald nodded. "So, what do you plan to do now?" Percy pondered over his grandpa's words carefully before replying. "I'll head out. I need to find a good place for Mickey to hunt, to avoid stunting his growth. I also need to get my soul repaired as soon as possible to resume sending clones. Though, I suppose those go hand in hand." Baldy didn't seem surprised, having probably expected that answer. "Any idea where specifically?" The young man didn't reply for a while. This was the part he hadn't figured out yet. "I'm not sure. Maybe I should take lots of missions like Elaine and only come back once every few weeks to restock on elixirs." Baldy's face fell. "I've been meaning to talk to you about the elixirs, actually. As you know, our family is fully transparent with who gets them and who doesn't. This policy has served us well for centuries, as it bolsters trust." Percy nodded, but he didn't like where Baldy was going with this. "Normally, it doesn't really matter, as the rules are fairly simple. Orangeborns and Yellowborns get them. Redborns don't." Archibald continued. "Until me," Percy realized. "Yes, so far, I've used the excuse of your soul clones being a promising thing for the family to justify giving you elixirs, but nobody knows the details. They have no idea how useful your clones are. Neither do they have a clue why I've been spending so much time with you." Galahad's outburst from earlier is actually a common sentiment among the family's management. The young man frowned. Indeed, between the weeks Baldy had spent filling his second core up, the several months of training together for the circulation spell, and all their other interactions, they had really spent a lot of time together. Even now, his grandpa was going to be with him the whole week. This should all seem suspicious to the rest of their family. Surely, they understand there must be a reason for it, right? Even if they don't know what. Baldy shook his head. "What reason could there be? Nobody could possibly imagine what your ability does. Sending your soul to other worlds. Most of them believe I've grown too attached to you for purely sentimental reasons. They think I'm just finding excuses to spoil you rotten." Percy's jaw slackened upon listening to his grandpa. He was glad his relationship with Baldy had improved, but he didn't know their actions had given rise to such a wave of discontent among his relatives. "So what does this mean?" Baldy sighed. "I can continue supplying you with a single set of elixirs. They won't like it, but it's within the limits of what I can justify based on your bloodline's importance. However, a second one is currently out of the question." "What?" "But I'll need it when my soul is repaired." He hadn't started cleansing both cores yet, as he created that clone soon after repairing his second core. Since then, his injuries had prevented him from maintaining the necessary mana, despite Mickey's help. But he was very much looking forward to changing this soon. "Is there no other way?" Baldy's next words gave him hope, however. "I can only think of two possible solutions." Chapter 32, Two Solutions. The young man looked at his grandpa expectantly, prompting him to speak. "The first option is to spill the beans on some of your secrets. Naturally, not circulation. That one could destroy our house if it leaks. But if we let the others know about your second core and Mickey, they will understand. Do you think it's a good idea? Percy asked. Not really, no. Baldy said before elaborating. I advise you not to do this. Even though others can't immediately benefit from your second core, it will still make our family a target. However, these are ultimately your secrets. If you want to go through with it, I won't stop you. It wouldn't be fair to hinder your growth like that. Percy nodded. He didn't much like the idea of bringing trouble to his house either, but he'd consider it if it was the only way. What about the second option? This one actually circles back to our earlier discussion. The young man perked up. I can think of a place where you'll find plenty of beasts for Mickey to eat. At the same time, you can earn as many elixirs as you need. But I must warn you that it's neither guaranteed nor easy. Where? The Alchemist's Guild. Percy frowned. Isn't that where they make the elixirs? You want me to become an alchemist? Yes, that place works with a system based on contribution points. You earn them by performing various tasks, and you can spend them on elixirs, ingredients, or alchemy lessons. The young man creased his brow, considering his grandpa's words. Becoming an alchemist wasn't something he'd ever imagined doing, but if Baldy thought it was a good idea, he wasn't necessarily against it. Do they let anyone join? Not anyone. The Alchemist's Guild is one of the most important places on all of Remir. Everyone needs the elixirs, even the Divine Order. Consequently, the guild is completely neutral, and nobody is allowed to stir trouble there. They only accept people recommended by a noble house. Okay, perhaps this was an even bigger deal than Percy thought. Won't the others be against it? They're already unhappy I get elixirs. Now I'm going to be brewing them. Baldy shrugged. It's not the same thing. It won't really affect our family either way. We still have to buy the elixirs at full price. It's not like there's any discount for having a relative there. As for anything you earn on your own, that's between you and the guild. So, is it common to send Redborns? It's not. Not that there's any rule against Redborns, but your lower grade will make it difficult to get points. Also, your shorter lifespan means people will generally view it as a waste of time for you to learn the art. Percy would be lying if he said he wasn't bothered. It seemed there wasn't anywhere on Remir he could go where he wouldn't be looked down upon. What about my affinities? Are they suitable for alchemy? They don't really matter. Water and fire help with some parts of the brewing process, though that's only a minor convenience. Life mana is good for growing herbs faster, but you can just buy those. That only leaves Mickey then. How will I explain him? This was by far the most important thing. He wouldn't leave him behind. After all, his friend was one of the main reasons why he'd even bother going in the first place. You won't. The guild is right next to where you'll be hunting the beasts. It's where the main ingredient for the elixirs comes from. Mickey will live there by himself and you'll join him whenever you can to hunt together. That way, you'll help him get his meals and he'll help you earn contribution points. But is it going to be safe? What if someone attacks him? Baldy shook his head. The hunting grounds are separated into various levels. Most of the people there are at a higher grade than you. Nobody ever goes to the bottom level as the beasts there are weaker than Mickey, and not worth killing. Even if somebody meets him by accident, they won't have any reason to bother him. Percy didn't immediately reply. He was still tired and this was a big decision. He'd rather sleep on it and give his grandpa his answer later. The two met up with Mickey before continuing to the forest. However, they didn't stop upon reaching the Whistling Woods. Instead, they kept walking for another hour. Okay, I think this is far enough, Baldy said. Percy began setting camp, as Mickey flew down, landing in front of Archibald. Baldy took a deep breath. Soon, the young man felt a terrifying amount of ambient mana flow towards his grandpa. It wasn't until a few seconds later that numerous green lines lit up under the man's skin. Their pattern looked very different from Percy's. Rather than simple curved lines, the ones on Baldy's skin swirled and branched out, making them resemble vines. Then Archibald placed his hand on Mickey's head, before a suffocating torrent of green gushed out of his body, flowing down to the familiar's abdomen. This was the main reason why Baldy had arranged to spend a week with them in the forest. Ever since he mastered circulation, Percy's grandpa volunteered to help the bird repair its second core. He wanted to thank Mickey for giving them the technique. Plus, the increased capacity and regeneration made the process much faster than it had been the first time around. Of course, they still had no idea where to get the mind mana. Percy couldn't exactly bring Mickey to the temple. The mist outside was much thinner too, so they'd have to lurk there for months, assuming the order even let them. Finally, finding a friendly violet core with a mind affinity willing to dedicate several weeks to help wasn't realistic either. Consequently, they hadn't rushed, only spending a couple of hours each day whenever Percy and Mickey returned home. Assuming the bird's core needed the same amount of mana as Percy's, they estimated they were already about 2/3 done. And Archibald planned to complete the project by the end of the week. Percy watched his grandpa fill up Mickey's core. They'd already been in the forest for 6 days. Yet the process wasn't done. He sure hoped they hadn't miscalculated, as he'd rather not have to look for a different source of life mana as well, for the final stretch. In any case, he'd worry about that later. Right now, Baldy's words still echoed in his mind. Going to the Alchemist's Guild would be a huge commitment. He didn't know anything about alchemy. Maybe he'd hate it. Or he'd suck at it. Even if he enjoyed it, who knew if he'd ever amass enough contribution points to cover his needs. His grandpa had emphasized he'd be at a massive disadvantage. Perhaps, he wouldn't even have enough elixirs for one of his cores, putting him at a worse position than before. Then there was the issue with Mickey. Despite Baldy's reassurances, Percy knew it would still be risky. This was Remir after all. There were plenty of unreasonable people out there who would harm a beast for sport. Hell, it would be hypocritical of him to even criticize them. He'd killed plenty of goblins himself just to get stronger. He knew he wouldn't care much about a random bird either if it wasn't his reincarnated friend. At the end of the day, everything boiled down to one simple fact. Despite the discrimination he'd faced growing up, Percy had spent his whole life under his grandpa's protection. The closest he'd ever come to losing his life had been due to his own recklessness when creating his familiar. But this would be different. There would be no certainties. Everything would depend entirely on his own ability. And his luck. Then he looked at Baldy. Perhaps his grandpa had been lucky enough to be born at yellow, but he'd still made himself into the man he was today. He wasn't dependent on others. Others depended on him. I want that, to be my own person. The young man nodded. He finally had his answer. He was about to tell Baldy. When he saw him stop pouring mana into the bird, it was done. Smiling, he opened Mickey's status to check it one last time, before heading to the Alchemist's Guild. Mictlantecuhtli, Percival's familiar. Mana cores. Mana core 1. Orange. Beast. Mana core 2. Seed. Incomplete. Grants the seed of a second mana core. Requires potent mind mana to germinate. Chapter 33, Trouble. It was a 2-week journey on horseback to the Alchemist's Guild. At least, the dirt road only passed through grasslands and barren fields, saving Percy the trouble of trekking through more forests or mountains. Not that the trip was without dangers. Baldy had given him a month's worth of elixirs, so that he wouldn't fall behind on his second core's purification. Unfortunately, the excessive amount of wealth was a double-edged sword, turning him into a juicy target for any aspiring robbers. The young man knew bandits frequented places like this, so he found it difficult to sleep at night. His family didn't have any justification to send escorts this time, making him easy prey for the criminals. Sure, he was the owner of a promising bloodline, but, as far as his relatives were concerned, he should have stayed locked up at home like a good little redborn, not risk his life on needless adventures. His only consolation was that he wasn't completely alone. Mickey flew nearby, a couple miles away, ready to help if something happened. Of course, that came with its own set of challenges as Percy didn't want to be seen too close to the bird, to avoid drawing suspicions. Just 5 more days of this. Nothing bad will happen. The good news was that they had already traveled nearly 2/3 of the trip without getting into trouble. Perhaps he shouldn't have been so quick to jinx it though. Shit, I think they're following me. For men rode just a couple 100 meters behind him. Normally, it wouldn't have necessarily meant much, as this was a popular road. Maybe they were regular travelers or merchants heading the same route. However, their movements were rather suspicious. Thanks to Mickey, Percy had noticed them before they saw him. At the time they had been riding much faster, but they slowed down as soon as he came into view, staying a fixed distance behind him ever since. They were still too far for him to examine their grades via mana sense, but it was easier for his familiar to pass over them and sneak a couple of glances before flying away. 3 orange cores, 1 yellow. Percy frowned. The only thing in his arsenal capable of harming a yellow was his parting gift. Even though his first core was at orange, his soul affinity was disproportionately geared towards offense. It was invisible, making it difficult to spot without mana sense. Fast too, making it hard to dodge if it caught them by surprise. It also phased through objects, making it nearly impossible to block. And lethal. Very lethal. If the stars aligned, he could definitely kill a yellow with it, as Mixcoatl had learned the hard way. But that's a big if. His soul magic downright sucked defensively, as he couldn't block incoming attacks either. It would be just as easy for his opponents to injure him, if not even more so. Plus, he couldn't gather soul mana right now, unless Mickey ate something first. Then, there was the rest of his magic. Circulation barely made up for his pure affinity, but his second core was still red. If it wasn't for his higher physical strength, he wouldn't be confident holding his own even against an orange core. As for Mickey, he might be able to keep one of them busy, at most. He shook his head. We can't confront them directly. His only option was to run, and hope his horse was both faster and less tired than theirs. He looked at the pouch strapped to his waist, hearing the gem bottles clinking with each bump. Archibald wasn't naive. He obviously understood the perils of the trip. Right before Percy set off, he told him to ditch the elixirs and bolt if he got into a situation like this. The bandits only wanted his money. They didn't give a damn about his life. Losing the bottles would sting, but they weren't worth dying over. Percy smiled bitterly. Leaving the pouch behind was the most logical course of action. He could always earn more elixirs later, but he was unwilling. This whole trip was a gamble. They didn't even know if he could make it in the guild. It was all a desperate attempt to earn enough elixirs for both of his cores. Was he really supposed to give up 20 doses before he even got there? Screw that. I'm not going to run from a bunch of lowlifes. Having made up his mind, he slowed down his horse. Mickey, whatever happens, stay away unless I say otherwise. He spoke through the connection. When the bandits reached him, they seemed quite surprised. They quickly hid their confusion though, replacing it with amiable-looking smiles as their leader approached him. He was probably going to pretend he was just a harmless traveler or something. But Percy wasn't interested in the charade. Before the criminal even spoke, the young man tossed over the pouch, eliciting a strange look from the former. Still, the bandit opened it, his eyes widening as his expression morphed into one of greed. I've got something even more valuable than those, if you leave me alive, Percy said. Ha ha ha, the bandit laughed. Kid, you seem to really understand what's good for you. Most people waste our time running away just to get killed a couple hours later. Percy shrugged. So, are you interested in hearing me out? The leader only chuckled, gesturing at him to speak. Receiving the affirmation, Percy slowly lifted his shirt, revealing a strange bandage wrapped tightly around his stomach. Multiple runes were engraved on the fabric. What's that? My family has developed a technique that lets us grow a second core. I keep it hidden for obvious reasons. The bandit gave him an odd look, probably thinking he was a lunatic, but didn't stop him, watching him unwrap the bandage. Just use your mana sense, and you'll know I'm telling the truth. A few seconds later, the criminal stared at him with his mouth agape. The others had also approached at some point, now flashing each other incredulous looks. And anybody can learn this? Percy nodded. There are a few steps, but as long as you have somebody guiding you, you'll all have a second core in a couple of months. Internally, he smirked. The first part of the plan had gone smoothly. He could already see the bandits salivating with greed. He wouldn't have to worry about them killing him anytime soon. Now, he just had to make sure none of them lived long enough to speak of his secrets. 3 more days passed as Percy traveled with the group. At first, they'd been suspicious of him, thinking he was up to something. He didn't exactly blame them either, because it was true. He seriously doubted they'd ever run into another target half as cooperative as he was. The leader had repeatedly questioned the validity of his words, warning him not so subtly things wouldn't end well for him if he tried anything funny. But they did appear to relax around him over time. He was sure part of it was because he made no attempt to escape, not even when they pretended to give him an opening. Another part was due to his demonstration of circulation. The bizarre technique was impressive enough on its own, as Percy showed them how it increased his strength sharply. Then he went into detail, explaining how it worked and how they could learn it, even guiding them into clearing their mana channels. In fact, he'd been truthful too, instructing them in earnest. Well, for the most part. The only lie he'd added was that circulation would grant them a second core once mastered. Revealing 2 of his secrets like that had been a risk, but a necessary one. His second core was the bait he'd needed to entice them on the first day so they wouldn't kill him on the spot. As for circulation, it was to convince them to keep him alive, as it was too complicated to learn without guidance. But there were a couple more hidden objectives he'd achieved. By explaining how he used the bandage to hide his second core, he'd diverted their attention from anything else he might do with it. Furthermore, by showing them his pure affinity coupled with circulation, he'd impressed them with its potential, while also making himself appear weaker than he was. Right now, they probably believed his first core lacked an affinity too. And the time to act was swiftly approaching, as one of the bandits left the group to pee behind a hill. Knowing this was probably the best chance he was going to get, Percy subtly wrapped the bandage around his right hand a couple of times. This was it. He took a deep breath, before speaking through the connection. Now, Mickey. Chapter 34, Unexpected Boon. The crow glided soundlessly just a meter above the grass as it approached its prey. Mickey's black feathers turned him nigh invisible against the dark blanket of the night. Soon, a man enlarged in their shared vision. He was looking the other way, performing his business without a care in the world. They could already hear the soft stream pitter-pattering against the stone. Percy held his breath. If the ambush failed, his life would be forfeit. With one powerful flap of his wings, Mickey shot through the last 15 or so feet, landing on the man's head. The poor bandit barely managed to turn around, before a talon clamped his mouth shut, as the other clawed his throat out. The young man exhaled the turbid air in his lungs as subtly as he could manage, trying not to alert the others. So far, so good. Then, Percy inhaled deeply again, directing the pure mana towards his abdomen, before pumping it through his channels. As for the soul mana, he gathered it in his sternum, fighting against his soul's pull. He walked towards the leader Rick, if his memory served him. Assassinating the yellow core was just as important as the previous ambush, if not doubly so. Accumulating soul mana was difficult at first, but a new stream gushed through the ethereal cord, helping him amass it more easily. This is a lot more than expected. The largest things Mickey had eaten in the past were the wood goblins. Being semi-sentient creatures, their souls were a lot more developed than the rats and snakes they had hunted before. Still, they couldn't possibly compare with a human at Orange. Percy didn't keep the mana in his core for very long though, swiftly drawing it into his fist instead. There, he willed it to condense under the cover of the bandage. What's wrong? Rick asked. Percy stopped a few meters away. I was thinking, are you guys going to let me go once I've taught you everything? Surely, you won't need anything else from me at that point, right? Hearing him, the bandit gave him the most amiable smile in the world, almost like an older brother reassuring his sibling that everything would be okay. Of course, you've been a huge help, kid. Just keep cooperating and we might even let you join our gang. Rick's casual acting sent a chill down Percy's spine. He was fairly certain they wouldn't let him go. It would be much safer to kill him than leave behind a trail for his family to latch on. Then the young man grinned back. But I suppose I have no intention of letting you scumbags go either, so I guess we're even. Percy had already gathered enough soul mana, though Rick couldn't see it. Even if he activated Mana Sense, the bandage would take care of it. Next, the young man willed it to harden and take the shape of his insidious weapon, before sending another message to his familiar. Draw their attention. A shadow shot up from behind the hill, the heads of the remaining bandits all snapping in that direction. Percy didn't care about that, however, as he bolted towards Rick, flicking his hand towards the man's torso. Noticing him at the last moment, the bandit leader pulled up a thick sheet of stone with a wave of his finger. But it wouldn't help him. Diverting a trickle of soul mana to his eyes, the young man watched the silver dagger phase through the rocky barrier unobstructed, piercing a hole through the man's soul as if it was a sheet of paper. The wound continued to widen even after the projectile popped out the other side. By the time Rick fell to his knees, his soul already sported a hole wider than a fist, his head making a sickening thud as he collapsed forward onto his own wall. The remaining two bandits took a few moments to catch on to what was happening. By then, the cyan lines had already lit up underneath Percy's skin, as the young man held the quarterstaff in one hand, a smaller version of the parting gift already forming in the other. He rushed towards one of the bandits. The other was about to help his buddy when Mickey dove down, trying to gouge out his eyeballs. While he failed to do so, the bandit having managed to roll to one side at the last moment, the familiar had successfully prevented him from reinforcing Percy's opponent. The young man, on the other hand, was having some trouble at first. His footwork did allow him to dodge most of the fireballs, but the few he was forced to parry made his weapon bend and crack, as the dispersed heat scorched his skin, making him wince. At least, this was the case for a few moments until his second weapon took shape. Ignoring the sweat and the blisters, he dashed towards the bandit, weaving between the incoming spells, closing the distance. A well-timed throw later, the third man was on the ground, his eyes glazed over like the two before him. Mickey wasn't having an easy time pinning down the last one. The criminal's air affinity was a bad match for the bird, preventing it from reaching him. Still, the tables swiftly turned once Percy joined the fight, the duo eliminating the final opponent not long after. The young man plopped down on the bloody dirt, breathing heavily. This had been his toughest fight yet, the first real one too. But he'd done it. He'd defeated a yellow core by himself and even took his henchmen out with him. And all of that without dying in the process. Crap, crap. Percy winced as his familiar pecked his shoulder in protest.
Okay.
We did it together. He smiled. Now go eat Rick's soul and core before they dissipate. Caw. Mickey wasn't entirely placated, but heeded the instruction, clearly thrilled at the prospect of such a gourmet meal. The young man rested on his back, a flood of mana soon filling his body. Shocked as the pressure intensified, he activated Mana Sense, only to be blinded by the bright yellow color filling his frame. Unable to discern anything, he switched to Soul Vision, but the intense silver glow wasn't much easier to peer through. I guess this must be how Mickey felt before learning to get rid of the excess mana. It was a lot to absorb at once, but Percy didn't ask his friend to stop eating. He knew such an opportunity was hard to come by. Rick's digested soul was by far the richest, most abundant source of soul mana they would come across anytime soon. It was a potent tonic, greatly accelerating his soul's recovery. Squinting, he just about managed to see his gruesome injuries closing in real time. The sight almost reminded him of the time his grandpa healed his physical wounds in mere moments. Mickey stopped producing soul mana about 10 minutes later, but fully processing it took them a couple hours longer. By then, only the crater in Percy's chest remained, and even that had shrunk to the size of an apple. Wow, maybe I should thank Rick for targeting me. Percy estimated he'd only need one more fight like this to fully recover. Of course, he had no intention of chasing more bandits or provoking other yellow cores, but even the orange beasts they would be hunting at their destination should do the trick in a few more weeks. In fact, he figured he could probably refill his core without Mickey's help right now. Caw. You're right. Better keep moving. The young man was spent, so resting for a few hours before resuming his journey didn't sound too bad. Sadly, the longer he remained here, the greater his odds of running into more trouble were. Getting to the guild as soon as possible was probably the wisest choice. Luckily, the bandits had traveled in the same direction, so he hadn't lost much time. Calculating the distance, Percy estimated he should be within a day of his destination. Standing up, he quickly scanned the corpses for anything valuable. Nothing. The poor bastards were broke. Retrieving his elixirs, he climbed onto his horse. Only one dose was missing from the pouch. Naturally, it would have been too wasteful for them to use the elixirs in their concentrated state. Percy's entire stash would have barely lasted them a week. Their next promotion had probably been decades away, so the elixirs wouldn't have made a dent like that. Instead, they had planned to dilute them all, making each dose last the group for nearly a month, the entire stash well over a year. And just for that one tiny bottle, they paid with their lives. Beside, this was the true Remir, away from his house's walls. A jungle where the lowborns like him had to place their lives on the line every single day for a small chance to survive. But I will, no matter what. Chapter 35, Scorpions. The azure flash sliced through the thick carapace as if it was butter. It might as well have been against the spell of a green. Elaine swung her arms a few more times, 3 whips lashing out with each move, dicing the rest of the creatures into pieces. Careful not to damage their stingers or their venom glands. It's what we're here for, Enid said. The blonde girl was having a bit more trouble at yellow, but her earth magic kept the enemies at bay at least. You don't have to worry about her, Enid. Princess knows what she's doing, Elaine said. Having inherited the bloodline, the boy's life affinity didn't help him much in a direct confrontation. Still, he reduced the pressure on his cousins by distracting the beasts with his clones. All I'm saying is, each scorpion is worth 4 silver. It would be a waste to lose some. Alright, stop bickering. I think we managed to preserve most of them, Elaine said. She wiped the sweat off her brow as the last of the creatures fell limp on the sand. Next, she walked to one of the more intact carcasses and sat against it. Drawing the last drops of mana from her core, she manifested a mouthful of water to quench her thirst. The worst thing about the desert was the suffocating heat. To add insult to injury, it wasn't particularly suited to her affinity either. Refilling her reserves took twice as long here. Still, she took deep breaths to recover as much as she could while resting. Enid soon joined her, also in need of a break. It wasn't like they hadn't considered helping Elaine harvest the loot, but the boy had volunteered to delegate the menial task to his clones. Instead, she summoned her status. Elaine Avalon. Mana core. Mana core. Green. Water. Spells. Whip. Crude. She sighed. Her status irked her every time she looked at it. Her first and only crude spell had registered several years ago, yet the upgrade still eluded her. Reaching wipe my ass. She smiled bitterly. She'd resolved to obtain a refined spell even before Percy's return from Huehue, yet here she was with nothing more than a single crude one over a year later. Not just that, but her cousin had achieved what she failed to, while still being at Orange. And he had 3 other spells too. Yet, despite being 2 full grades above him, Elaine couldn't even manage it with Percy holding her hand, walking her through the process. Strengthening her body and tempering her mana channels had been fine, but she just couldn't figure out the correct pattern for her affinity. Such an embarrassment. The only thing she could do was to resume taking mission after mission, focusing on her whip instead. At least she could now summon a whopping 6 constructs at once. Sadly, sheer quantity didn't a refined spell make. Alright, that's all of them, Elaine said, breaking her out of her thoughts. 4 men stood behind him, each with a face identical to his own, save for their soulless gazes. They didn't utter a word of complaint, despite the heavy-looking sacks they were holding over their shoulders, filled to the brim with grimy scorpion parts. One even had a stinger sticking out of the bag, passing just inches from the clone's cheek, but he didn't seem bothered in the slightest. Finally, Enid jumped to her feet excitedly. I can't wait to take a bath and sleep on a proper bed. She looked at Elaine expectantly, silently urging her to get a move on. Faced with her cousin's eagerness, the latter acquiesced, pushing herself up as the corner of her lips curved upwards. Elaine and Enid were both Orangeborns, but they didn't waste their time wallowing in self-pity. What right did she have to be unhappy? The trio was about to head out, when a sudden burst of sand blinded them. Elaine opened her eyes just a second later, only to be greeted by a gruesome sight. 3 figures were lying on the ground, pinned down by long stingers. Each was twice as thick and thrice as long as those of the regular scorpions, making them resemble lances more than monster parts. They were a deep purple color, dripping with droplets a shade paler. SSSSSS. Every time the liquid landed on the victim's skin, it sizzled, releasing smoke that carried a putrid smell with it. The appalling scene made Elaine tremble in abject terror for a moment. Luckily, she soon regained her wit. Those 3 weren't her real cousins, just clones. Elaine and Enid were both okay, lying a few meters away, fortunate enough the abomination hadn't targeted them. Get up! Fast! She yelled, already stirring the mana in her sternum. She'd only managed to recover about a third, but it would have to do. Her cousins heard her, scrambling to stand. Sadly, they weren't fast enough. A second mound of sand exploded just under where Elaine was, a deafening sound ringing in their ears. As soon as the clouds settled somewhat, Elaine saw a colossal pincer pointing towards the sky, chunks of wet gore hanging off its serrated edges. Its base was drenched in a crimson pool which kept deepening as the blood gushed out of the 2 halves of her cousin's lifeless body. Ea-ha-a-weya. Enid's scream was the only thing that stopped Elaine from throwing up on the spot. Prying her eyes off Elaine's corpse, she turned towards her last surviving teammate. A second pincer had pierced through the sand at some point, but luckily it had missed. Although shaken, Enid was still in one piece. Elaine dashed, ignoring the protests of her tired legs, picking her cousin off the ground as she kept running, trying to put distance from the monster. She felt the sand shake as a tremor coursed through her surroundings. Resisting the urge to look back, she activated her mana sense instead. A bright green star thrummed in the beast's frame, as multiple streams of the same color flowed through its visage. It was using its pincers to pull itself up, its body already halfway above the surface. This scorpion was the size of an elephant, with 3 long tails flailing above it. Being the same grade as the creature, Elaine knew she should be able to defeat it normally, but not with so little mana and not while keeping Enid safe. Right now, her best course of action was to flee. Unfortunately, the beast wasn't quite ready to let them go, however. As soon as it was done unlodging itself from the makeshift tunnel, its 3 pairs of legs began stabbing and pushing against the sand, the scorpion's heavy frame accelerating towards them. Like a battering ram, the abomination crashed through the dunes, barely slowing down. It's catching up. Elaine grimaced. There was no way she could outrun the monster in its own element. Certainly not while carrying somebody. She summoned all her strength to toss her cousin as far ahead as she could manage. Perhaps the fall might have injured a regular human, but the girl was at yellow, so she just rolled harmlessly on the soft sand. Not that she would survive long if Elaine failed to kill the beast. Hopefully, this would keep her out of the fight though. Turning around, Elaine took another deep breath, briefly entertaining the thought of breaking through the last barrier and mastering circulation right then and there. Then, she chuckled bitterly. Not a chance. Even if she could miraculously come up with the burst of inspiration she needed, the arid desert air made this the worst possible place to circulate water mana. No, she'd have to make do with the only spell she had. Her measly reserves wouldn't last for a prolonged fight either. I guess I'll have to kill it in one shot. The scorpion approached rapidly. Its massive body was only a dozen meters away when a wave of calm took over her. A strange thought passing through her mind. Is this what Percy feels like every time he gets in a fight? Elaine had completed countless missions, but she couldn't remember coming this close to dying before. Most of the time, her green core was enough to make quick work of the orange and yellow beasts she hunted. Even the few green ones she'd faced had been under better circumstances. Was this how it felt to put her life on the line? She shook her head. This wasn't the time for silly thoughts. Drawing all the mana from her core and summoning all the strength in her muscles, she spun her body towards the beast to build up as much momentum as she could manage. She figured every little bit might make the difference. 3 whips formed in each hand, but she didn't stop there. She willed them to turn even firmer, even sharper than before, as a 4th one began to manifest. By the time the shadow of the scorpion loomed over her, she could hardly even see it. It was all a blur, the spinning blades of azure dominating her sight, as they whistled shrilly, slicing through the air. The impact she did feel, however. The whips bent, a couple of them even snapping as a mountain collided with them. Having absorbed most of the weight, her constructs saved her from being squashed into paste. But the wind was still knocked out of her lungs, waves of pain rippling through her body. Her joints buckled, her bones creaked, and she could feel her soles burn as she and the monster both slid through the scorching sand. But she didn't stop spinning. She kept focusing on her whips, her only way out, as she commanded them to reform, to sharpen even more, to carve out anything in their path. Shriite. The grating sound intensified as she picked up speed. The mana was dwindling at a frightening rate, the whips thinning into mere threads, but they still felt stronger than before, somehow. Elaine didn't stop. She couldn't stop. A moment's hesitation would mean her death. Enid's too. She kept spinning in place, her world consumed into a whirlwind of azure, as all other senses vanished. Congratulations. Your spell has evolved. Whip, crude dash, Kraken's gambit, refined. It wasn't until a long time later she realized she was no longer sliding through the sand. The grating screech had stopped too. There was nothing pushing against her. But she didn't let go of the mana right away. She didn't want to risk it. Elaine. At some point, she scarcely registered a voice. Enid's. It's over. It's dead. Her cousin added after a moment. Only then did she allow the spell to fizzle out, plopping down weakly. Yet, it wasn't the dry mound of sand she was expecting. Her everything still spun, though she scarcely registered a greenish chunk of wet chitin in front of her eyes. She tried shifting around. All her muscles hurt. She felt more of the goo around her with every movement. She was practically swimming in the stuff. I'll need some help getting home. Chapter 36, Fungal Spire. Technically, Baldy had explained what they would find at their destination. Perhaps, Percy shouldn't have been so taken aback by the sight before him. Yet here he was, blinking repeatedly, struggling to believe his eyes. Maybe they were playing tricks on him, tired as they were from the long journey. Caw. Caw. Yeah. I didn't realize it was going to be this big either. The Alchemist's Guild was situated next to an extraordinary structure resembling a conical tree. An impossibly tall one too, its tip lost above the clouds. It was adorned from top to bottom with bright lights of all colors, making it appear man-made, seemingly erected for some grand festival. Yet, this assessment couldn't be further from the truth. To start with, this was no plant at all. Strictly speaking, it was a mountain. Its trunk was really a narrow column of rock, several miles long, thrusting towards the sky like a giant spear. There was nothing artificial about it either. Countless huge mushrooms grew all over the steep slope, their stems bending upwards. As a result, their caps faced the stars, forming platforms hundreds of meters wide. These titanic protrusions constantly released mana of all types, giving the place its varied glow. So, this is the fungal spire. According to his grandpa, it was among the greatest natural treasures on Remir. Also, one of the main reasons other races targeted them. Multiple underground rivers of mana converged beneath it, allowing the monstrous fungi to flourish. This, in turn, had given rise to a truly bizarre ecosystem where the main ingredient for the elixirs could be found. The guild, where Percy would be living, was built at its base, while the hunting grounds, where he and Mickey would spend most of their time, were the giant mushrooms themselves. Caw! Reminded by his familiar's cry, the young man gently tapped the horse's side with his heel, urging it to gallop faster. There would be plenty of time for sightseeing later. He shouldn't delay and risk getting attacked again. His relief was palpable as the guild's entrance came into view. At last, he was safe. The lack of a queue is a welcome bonus too. Not that this wasn't a popular destination. Quite the opposite, in fact. Aspiring alchemists and merchants traveled to the guild all year round. Still, it couldn't compare with the traffic to the Order's temples, where a third of Remir's children were brought to take the test. Certainly not this late at night. Everything okay on your end? Percy had bid his familiar farewell a few minutes ago. The bird couldn't follow him into the guild proper, so the plan was for Mickey to circle around and find a place to stay on the other side of the trunk. Apparently, the base of the spire was designated as the bottom level of the hunting grounds, mostly populated by red beasts. There, the bird could fly around unobstructed, with nothing daring to approach. Of course, the guild had numerous squads patrolling the perimeter of the structure, to prevent intruders from entering without authorization. That said, they wouldn't care much about a lone beast passing through the bottom level. Caw! After receiving confirmation from his friend that he was all right, Percy walked up to the guards. The two men wore green robes, the same color as their cores. The clothes were neat, but not nearly as over-the-top as the funny-looking togas and sandals of the guards at the temple. They were half asleep, one even startled by his appearance, probably not expecting any visitors past midnight. Still, they were professionals. Without complaint, they requested his official documents backing his purpose at the guild. Percy took out his grandpa's letter, which one of the guards skimmed through rather quickly, before handing him a wooden badge. This is only for guests. You'll have to register properly inside the third building to your left. But it's not open at this time. For now, keep going until you reach the building with the blue door and then head right until you get to the inn. You can stay the night there for free. The stables are next door. Percy nodded, walking inside, his horse in tow. As soon as he entered the settlement, his eyes widened. Motes of light danced in the wind, like colorful snowflakes painting everything in joy and wonder. He'd seen some outside too, but they were much denser here, probably thanks to some large-scale enchantment keeping them within the guild's perimeter. The tiny orbs faded into nothingness every time they touched an object, a red one startling him as it landed on his nose. They must all be coming from the mushrooms. Instinctively, he tilted his head up, gawking at the blinding sea of colors slowly descending from the sky. Even more numerous than stars, they shifted and mixed, forming ever-changing patterns of raw magic. A question suddenly popped up in his head. Can I absorb them? He took a deep breath, letting the motes spiral into his lungs as he directed the mana to his two cores. His regeneration was slightly faster than outside, maybe by 20% or so. But that was about it. It would make fighting atop the giant fungi slightly more convenient. That said, the difference wouldn't be great. Mickey might be able to get some mind mana for his second core too, although it would be negligible. It couldn't even compare with the red mist outside the Order's temple, so it would take the familiar years to amass enough at this rate. Percy would still have to find a different source, which was one of his goals for the near future. Then he shook his head. That's tomorrow's problem. Let's get some sleep now. Following the guard's instructions, he slowly made his way towards the inn, all the while appreciating the sights around him. The architecture was very different to what he was used to. Unlike his family's mansion, which was mostly made of wood, all the buildings here were made of stone. Not just that, but they all appeared to be in pristine condition, as if they had only been built days ago. Of course, this wasn't the case. The Alchemist's Guild was even older than the Avalon House. Many times so, in fact. Percy wouldn't be surprised if these houses and shops had been here for tens of millennia already. They must be enchanted with preservation runes. The young man didn't miss the numerous glyphs dimly shimmering along the polished surfaces. The symbols shone a touch more brightly every time one of the colorful motes landed on them, before fading a moment later. Soon he found the inn. He skipped it for now, entering the stables instead. Luckily, they were open, manned by a clerk in a uniform like that of the guards, although his was yellow. There weren't many horses inside. Not many people used them on Remir, as traveling on foot was easier once you reached yellow. With 9 times the speed and endurance of a regular human, the only reason for a yellow or higher to ride a horse would be if they were escorting somebody at a lower grade. Even then, they technically had the option of carrying that person themselves, although it would look awkward and downright silly. Percy chuckled, imagining Gawain giving him a piggyback ride, or Rick stacking his 3 lackeys on his back like sacks of rice. How long do you want us to keep it for you? The clerk asked, breaking him out of his thoughts. Percy felt some heat gather in his cheeks upon realizing he'd looked like a maniac, laughing to himself. Then he shrugged. Can I sell it instead? I'm not going to be leaving anytime soon. It would be cheaper to buy another horse when it was time to go, if he even needed one by then. Strictly speaking, Percy had no idea how long he was going to stay. It would depend on many factors he couldn't account for at the moment, such as his success or failure in the guild, or whatever treasures his future clones managed to bring back to Remir. Still, he estimated he'd be here for at least a year or 2. The man nodded, slamming a red coin on the counter, prompting Percy to raise an eyebrow. Ha! I guess you're new here. This coin is worth 1 contribution point. The colors follow the same pattern as grades, with orange coins worth 10, yellow 100 and so on. You'll need them for everything you buy or sell in the guild. The young man picked the coin up, examining it for a couple of moments in intrigue before tossing it in his pocket. He was about to flood the clerk with a ton of questions, but the guy beat him to it, raising a hand. Look, kid. I know you want to ask me more stuff, but they'll explain everything at the orientation when you register tomorrow. For now, go get some sleep. You look like crap.
No offense.
Percy wasn't bothered, realizing the clerk was most likely right. He thanked him before leaving. Entering the inn, he showed his wooden badge to the guy there, before being led to his room for the night. It wasn't the most luxurious place, but it was clean at least, probably enchanted for that. It sure beat Mickey's cell on Huehue. His own room back at home too, though not by a huge margin. I guess this is my home now. Percy would be lying if he said he wasn't worried. He knew he'd be safe inside the guild, and he'd already checked up on his familiar 6 times since entering the settlement. Still, he had no idea what tomorrow would bring. Would he thrive in this place, or sink to the bottom and be forgotten? Only one way to find out, I suppose. Chapter 37 Registration. As soon as the first rays of sunlight entered his room, Percy's eyes bolted open. The young man practically leapt to his feet, eager to register as an alchemist and begin hunting right away. He was still tired, having only barely managed to catch a couple hours of sleep. Not that he hadn't tried to rest some more, but his anxiety and anticipation had narrowly won over his exhaustion. That said, he was at least functional right now and he didn't want to leave his familiar alone out there a moment longer than necessary. Mickey, how are you doing? The response came delayed and strained. Caw. With it, Percy received a close-up image of a tree's branches, presumably where the bird had nested for the night. The young man hadn't missed the hint of annoyance contained in his friend's reply either. Mickey should have just woken up. Percy chuckled. I'm sorry, buddy. Had to make sure you were okay. Exiting the inn, he briefly paused to appreciate the scenery. The colorful motes looked different than before, glinting as they fluttered in the soft light, but they were just as beautiful as last night, if not more so. There was some movement in the streets too, although not as much as he expected. I guess most people don't wake up this early. The few he did see all wore the guild's uniform, with varying colors matching their grade. Most were yellow, but he did spot a couple greens and even a blue at some point. As for anything lower, he had yet to see one. Hopefully it's not compulsory to wear it. I'm gonna stick out like a sore thumb if I'm the only one in orange robes. He grimaced at the thought. Retracing his steps from the night before, he recalled the guard's instructions, trying to find the registration office. He did make it there eventually, albeit after having taken a couple wrong turns and being forced to ask a passerby. I blame the fatigue. Luckily, the building was already open, sparing him the torture of waiting outside. A clerk greeted him with a smile. Good morning. We'll need your guest badge, your recommendation letter, and some details about yourself, he said, passing him a piece of paper and a quill. Percy handed him the wooden badge and his grandpa's letter before examining the document. It was a form, meant to be filled with all sorts of personal information. My name, age, family, grade at birth, current grade, affinity, bloodline, reasons for joining the guild, prior experience with alchemy. It all looked standard, although he wasn't comfortable with all the fields. Naturally, he wouldn't reveal anything about his second core, but he had to be truthful about his first one. Is anything wrong? The clerk asked after a minute. Well, I was just wondering, what do you need all this information for? The man chuckled. Don't be so stressed. I know it's a jungle out there, but you don't have anything to worry about as long as you're within the jurisdiction of the guild. We need to know some basic things about the people who work here to make sure everything is in order. However, nobody will leak details of your bloodline or use any of the information you provide to harm you. Percy nodded, albeit reluctantly. This was in line with what Baldy had explained, but it still felt weird being so open about his soul affinity and his ability. Logically, he understood nobody would piece together its function. And even if somebody wanted to hurt him, it wasn't like they needed this information to do so. Still, he felt his stomach churn after he was done, as if he had been stripped naked in front of a stranger. Great. It will take about an hour to process your registration and prepare your new badge and clothes. In the meantime, please follow me. The clerk was already walking down a corridor by the time he finished speaking. Percy hurriedly caught up. About the robes. Is wearing them mandatory? He asked with some hope in his eyes. The man tossed him an apologetic look, probably realizing the source of his concern. Afraid so. Still, I assure you that your lower grade won't affect your ability to access any of the guild's facilities. If you suspect anyone has refused to accommodate you just because of that, make sure to report them to the guild's management. Percy's expression fell at the beginning of the clerk's response, although he had to admit he did feel better by the end. Soon they reached an open door. It led to a small room with a few sets of desks and chairs facing a blackboard. There were 2 people already sitting in there, neither of them wearing the guild's robes. To save time, we explain everything to you in batches. The clerk said, please wait in this room for now. Your orientation will begin once a few more people gather. After he left, Percy looked at the other newcomers. Both appeared around his age, although it would be misleading to make any assumptions based on that alone. Having reached adulthood, it would take them decades for any physical changes to show given their yellow cores. They also checked him out at first, but quickly frowned and grew disinterested upon noticing his grade. Despite what the clerk had said, people wouldn't stop looking down on him just like that. At most, the guild's rules forced people to not decline him any important services, but their thoughts were still their own. Okay, fine. No talking then. Let's all wait in silence. And wait they did for several more hours. 3 more people were brought in by the clerk at various points, but he didn't seem keen on beginning the orientation just yet. Percy entertained himself by peering through his familiar's eyes, watching the bird hunt some black wasp-like creatures, stuffing its face full of red cores. The others in the room didn't have that option, however. How much longer until we start? I've been here for 6 hours. One of them yelled at the clerk the next time he showed up. I apologize for the delay. Usually we do this in groups of 7. Unfortunately, it's been a slow day today. If nobody shows up in the next hour, we'll start anyway. The reactions were mixed. Some were visibly annoyed hearing they had to wait longer, while others appeared relieved to finally have a concrete time frame. As for Percy, he was a bit more neutral on all this. He still itched to head out and begin hunting, of course, but he was no longer worried about Mickey. It was hard to be, after watching the bird play around all morning. Either way, the clerk returned just a few minutes later to put them out of their misery, with the 7th person in tow. She was a girl in her late teens, her tousled dark hair barely reaching her shoulders. It matched the color of her eyes, half hidden behind glasses. Her frame was petite, dressed in casual clothes. Not exactly what one would expect from a noble lady. In fact, unlike the others in the room, Percy failed to recognize her house's insignia. Must be a new family. Either way, she was at yellow like everyone else besides him. He figured they were all Orangeborns too. It fit with their appearances. They didn't look old enough to be Redborns or young enough to be Yellowborns. At least, the new girl didn't look at him with ridicule like the rest. Well, technically she didn't even spare him a glance at all, or anyone else for that matter. Ignoring all the annoyed glares aimed her way, she sat at the nearest chair, before resting her face down on the desk. Evidently, she was only going through the motions, still half asleep. It's past noon already. She's even worse than Mickey. The clerk cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. His gaze lingered on the drowsy girl for a moment, but he didn't dwell on her. I apologize again this took so long, but we can finally begin. Chapter 38, Orientation. The first part of the clerk's explanation wasn't anything too eye-opening. He went over some mundane things like how they were expected to conduct themselves within the guild. The summary was that they were pretty much allowed to do whatever they wanted, as long as they wore the uniforms, treated others politely, and didn't kill, steal, or cheat. Each of them was going to be handed 5 contribution points to start with. It wasn't a huge sum, but it was more than sufficient to cover their food and accommodation for their first month. Beyond that, they would have to pay for their expenses out of their own pocket. That said, the bare necessities weren't difficult to earn enough for. The clerk even gave them a quick overview of the settlement, showing them where to find shops, inns, restaurants, and other important facilities on a map. So far, so good, Percy thought, suppressing a yawn. It was the next part of the orientation that caused his eyes to widen. This was what he was interested in. The reason most of you are here are naturally the elixirs we all need to advance. Our guild is where they are produced. You can learn to brew them yourselves, but you can also buy them with contribution points. How much does a dose cost? Somebody asked. The clerk smiled bitterly. For 100 points. His response elicited sharp breaths from the audience. Per day. That's enough to buy food and accommodation for 7 years. After waiting for the chatter to die out, the clerk spoke again. It's indeed expensive, but you knew that already. It's not any cheaper to buy it from the guild than elsewhere. However, you can find all sorts of opportunities to earn contribution points here. The room remained quiet, prompting him to continue. There are many ways to get them. The simpler ones are jobs like what I'm doing right now. He smiled. Although these posts don't pay that well, we typically treat them as a vacation, for when we want to take things easy for a couple of weeks. Then, what's the most profitable method? An initiate asked. Alchemy, obviously. After all, it's the guild's specialty. There is no better way to earn points than to brew your own elixirs and make a killing selling the excess to others, but I'm afraid there's a catch. Nobody looked surprised by his words. If it was that easy, nobody would bother with anything else. Learning the art is a time-consuming process and a colossal money sink. You'll have to spend months if not years to get any good at it. You'll need to throw a warehouse of ingredients down the gutter too. Until then, you'll be losing more points than you earn. Everyone's faces fell, but he continued. Consequently, I advise you to forget about alchemy for the time being. If you have lofty aspirations to live a life of luxury and wealth, it might be something for you to work towards in the long term. For now, your best bet is to venture out into the fungal spire and hunt the starry wasps. What does that involve? A young man asked. Percy recognized him as one of the two people who'd arrived earlier than him. The clerk proceeded to explain how the hunting grounds worked. Essentially, the fungal spire was segregated into 5 levels, based on the grade of the beasts living there. The higher one ascended, the stronger the wasps got. At the ground level, where Mickey was currently staying, you could only find starry drones, which had red cores and were about as large as a man's fist. Further up, one could find starry workers, soldiers, knights, and commanders, which progressively increased in both size and grade all the way to blue. There was even rumored to be a starry queen with a violet core hiding somewhere in the depths of the fungal spire. However, nobody could verify if this was true, as entering the structure was strictly prohibited. The number of insects living inside the spire vastly eclipsed the few that wandered outside. Still, the guild's foremost priority was to preserve the local ecosystem, so people were only allowed to freely roam and hunt on the giant mushrooms. What you want to harvest is the special gland that all types of wasps share just a few inches below their core. According to the clerk, this unique organ contained a few drops of nectar, the primary ingredient for the elixirs. The amount of nectar contained in each gland depended on the grade of the creature. Apparently, the starry drones at the bottom level usually carried 5 drops, with each higher grade having 3 times as much as the one below. Each drop of nectar was valued at precisely 1 contribution point, or perhaps it might be more accurate to say it was the other way around. Clearly, the entire economy of the Alchemist's Guild had been built around the exotic substance. At the end of the day, it all comes down to your combat ability. If you're good, you can kill a lot of wasps per day and make a ton of points. Sadly, it means that some of you may be at a bit of a disadvantage. Percy didn't appreciate how everyone turned towards him after that statement. They aren't wrong though. Most of these people would be hunting the starry soldiers on the 3rd level, while he and Mickey would have to make do with the workers on the 2nd one. Still, this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. He actually liked the idea of having an entire level to himself. After all, he had many secrets. Hunting in a crowded area would be inconvenient. Any questions? The clerk asked after finishing. Only one person raised her hand. It was the girl with the glasses who had arrived last. She'd spent the entire orientation face down on the desk, so Percy assumed she'd slept through the whole thing. The clerk didn't look very pleased either, creasing his brow. He probably thought she was going to ask about something he'd already explained. Still, he didn't stop her. Are we obligated to hunt or brew? The man raised an eyebrow, not expecting that question. Well, no. Nobody can tell you what to do. If you want to stick to other jobs and only pay for your expenses, you're technically allowed to do that. But you won't be able to afford the elixirs that way. Why even come to the guild if you aren't willing to do those things? Drowsy girl nodded absent-mindedly, seemingly satisfied with the answer. She didn't say much else, instead falling back to her desk, resuming her nap. The clerk spent another 5 minutes giving them a few more tips and instructions. Next, he politely asked them to leave the room to make space for the next batch after handing them their badges and robes. Finding a place to stay wasn't difficult. The guild was full of empty houses, all made of the same enchanted stone, waiting for new members to claim them. Percy picked a spot near the back gate of the settlement, for easier access to the spire. He only needed to press his badge against a rune on the door to register himself as the new owner, allowing him to enter and lock as he pleased. At the end of each month, he'd have to pay rent at a designated spot to get the badge recharged. After a quick look inside, he took a shower before changing into the orange robes. It was still annoying he had to wear them everywhere, but at least they felt comfortable enough to hunt in. Having not had a chance earlier, he gulped down his daily dose of the elixir, leaving the last few vials in his possession back home, before heading out for some shopping. Despite being quite hungry, he didn't buy much, settling for a loaf of bread. He munched on it on the way back, figuring he could return for more stuff later. Right now, he'd rather avoid wasting more time. It was already late in the afternoon. He'd accepted he wouldn't get much hunting done today, but he wanted to at least meet up with Mickey and explore the 1st level to familiarize himself with the area. Leaving through the back gate, he ignored the suspension bridge leading up the 1st mushroom. That was the way to the 2nd level, which he'd worry about tomorrow. Remaining on the ground, he began circling around the mountain. The entire trip would have taken him several hours, but he'd already asked his familiar to meet him halfway. The bird flew much faster than he walked too. Although Mickey had kept him updated throughout the day, the young man couldn't help but exhale in relief after seeing him in person. This was the longest they had ever spent apart. Caw, caw. Evidently, the familiar felt the same way. So, care to show me around your new home? I want to see what these starry wasps are all about. Chapter 39, Starry Drones. It wasn't like he hadn't searched for the bugs on the way, but he hadn't found any. The colorful motes impaired visibility and even interfered with mana sense. Caw. The bird threw a quick glance around, before flying a certain direction. A few moments later, it returned with something squirming in its beak. Its shape wasn't much different from a regular wasp's, but it was much larger. For the most part, its carapace was black. However, Percy didn't miss the numerous tiny dots glittering along the slick chitin, resembling the motes in their surroundings. Okay, so they blend in the environment. How did you find it so easily? Mickey hadn't struggled much to locate the oversized bug, seemingly unaffected by its camouflage. The familiar pointed to its eyes with a wing. Caw, caw. Percy smiled wryly. Not very helpful. I wouldn't be able to spot one further than 20 feet away, unless, gathering some soul mana into his eyes, 3 silver flames of various shapes and sizes came into view. His own was the largest, followed by Mickey's. The wasp's wasn't nearly as bright, merely a wisp on the verge of being snuffed out, but it was there nonetheless. This was good news. Due to his nature as a familiar, Mickey had manifested some unique abilities allowing him to interact with the souls of others. At the beginning, it had only affected his beak, letting him consume the souls of his prey. Following his advancement to orange, however, it had extended to his talons and eyes. Evidently, while the colorful motes affected both mana sense and regular sight, they weren't alive and thus could be filtered out through soul vision. It's nice to know we have at least one advantage over others. Still, Percy failed to spot any other wasps nearby. Apparently, they were somewhat scarce. Despite having the ability to see them, he and Mickey would have to move around a lot. Eat its core, but be careful not to damage anything else. The bird heeded his instructions, swiftly putting the wasp out of its misery, cawing in satisfaction after swallowing the tasty snack. Pulling a knife out, Percy carefully sliced open the bug's thorax vertically, before placing his fingers inside, searching for something. A few moments later, he pulled out a soft, squishy ball about half the size of a cherry. Taking a small vial out of his pocket, he uncorked it with his mouth before cutting a small hole into the gland and squeezing it above the bottle's opening. A drop of a viscous liquid fell inside. It glowed in a rich amber color, looking a bit like magic honey. On second thought, isn't that precisely what this is? The young man compressed the gland more firmly, until he counted 5 drops. This was already worth as much as what the guild had given him. Clearly, the clerk wasn't kidding when he said it would be easy to make a living. Still, I need 800 drops per day for both of my cores. It was a huge sum. Percy wasn't sure if it was even possible to get that much. Mickey and Soul Vision would certainly help, but they'd need to hunt 160 starry drones on average. Mickey, let's play a game. Whoever finds the most wasps in the next 2 hours wins. Caw. The familiar was over the moon, having barely eked out a victory in their little competition. Percy wasn't nearly as excited on the other hand, although his loss wasn't what soured his mood. As expected, hunting on the first floor isn't very efficient. The two had only found another 5 wasps by the end. Extrapolating, he estimated that even if they spent all day doing this from now on, they'd only get about 200 contribution points, barely half a dose. A quarter of what he needed. It was not all bad, however. Killing the drones was easy as they didn't put up much of a fight, making the ground floor quite safe. He was also certain nobody in their right mind would ever bother with it either, meaning he wouldn't have to worry about his secrets leaking. Finally, he was confident he and Mickey would improve with some more experience, increasing their harvest after a few more weeks. Still, it won't be enough. He shook his head. But that was fine. He hadn't expected this to work. His goal had always been the second level, the starry workers there being more suitable for their grades. Even if he ignored the fact they possessed 3 times as much nectar as the drones, their orange cores would accelerate Mickey's advancement and their souls would do the same for his own recovery. Squeezing the rest of his loot into the vial, he shook it a few times, marveling at the expensive liquid swirling at the bottom. It wasn't nearly as much as he needed, but it was a start. His goal for tomorrow would be to do better. Percy bid his familiar farewell, before heading back towards the settlement. The sun had already set a while ago, but according to the clerk the shops shouldn't have closed yet. The young man hoped to get some supplies for his new abode. He would be staying there for some time after all. He might as well make it comfortable. Percy was carrying 4 paper bags full of groceries. While he had come across a lot of exotic spices and ingredients they didn't have back at the mansion, he had kept his shopping fairly barebones. He'd only gone for things like bread, milk, eggs, and some fruit. After all, he'd never learned to cook, and he doubted he'd have the time for a new hobby anytime soon. Maybe one day. He was only a couple blocks away from his new house when an interesting smell caught his attention. It came from his left, where a small stall stood. It was operated by a plump guy lighting a stove with fire magic. This was the first person Percy had seen wearing an orange robe. He looked a bit older than the others too, seemingly in his mid-30s. A Redborn. The guy noticed him as well, waving at him to approach. First day here. What gave me away? Nothing really. I just haven't seen you before. He handed Percy something warm, wrapped in a piece of parchment. The young man sniffed a couple of times, trying to discern what it was. It looked a bit like a pancake, dripping with honey. However, it had been rolled up and it was crispy too. Percy struggled to keep himself from drooling. What is it? It looks delicious. It tastes even better. The guy grinned. I call them honey rolls. How much? Percy asked, reaching into his pocket. The guy shook his head. First one's on the house. Think of it like a welcome gift. Or Redborn solidarity if you prefer. Thanks. If the guy was offering, Percy wouldn't stand on ceremony. He bit a chunk out of the honey roll. The dude wasn't kidding. This was heaven. The thin crust gave way, crunching under his teeth, as the flavor of the honey blended with the warm dough. Maybe he was a little biased, having lived off dried rations for 2 weeks followed by some bland bread. That said, he'd bet money this would still taste good tomorrow. Suddenly, a strange thought crossed his mind. Don't tell me you're using nectar? Ah, as if, what moron would waste an elixir's worth of nectar on a snack? The plump dude chuckled. Besides, I doubt it would even taste that good. This is just regular honey. He added after a moment. Percy nodded. That made sense. Name's Freddy, the plump guy said, extending his hand. The young man hurriedly wiped his on the parchment a couple of times, before reciprocating. Percy, are you also doing this as a vacation? The clerk from the orientation said, you can't afford the elixirs without hunting wasps or learning to brew. Freddy's face fell at his question, making Percy realize he might have asked something inappropriate. He was about to apologize, but the guy spoke first. He was right. My honey rolls are rather popular, if I may say so myself. Still, nowhere near enough. He remained silent for a few seconds, before continuing. But I've given up on hunting. Even after busting my ass, I could barely make 300 points on a good day. It would still be enough to get the expensive elixir every other day or something. But I figured it wasn't worth the trouble. Right now, I've settled on the diluted ones. Percy felt the urge to protest, to tell Freddy not to give up. But he suppressed it. What do I even know? I just got here. The two chatted for a few minutes, switching to some more lighthearted topics, before Percy left. His expression was downtrodden by the time he got home. Freddy was a nice guy, a Redborn like him, who had probably come to the Alchemists' Guild harboring the same dream. And the cruel reality had chipped away at it for years, until nothing remained. Percy's final thought before he dozed off was a resolute one. I won't let this happen to me. Chapter 40 Starry Workers. Percy had experienced a few peculiar things in his relatively short life. More than the average person on Remir, at least. After all, how many could boast of traversing the space between worlds with their soul, or fighting in an alien arena? Still, walking atop a giant mushroom just had to make the list. And it wasn't the first one today either. Each level of the fungal spire contained hundreds of them, the smallest being wide enough to fit a minor village. As for the largest, it was bigger than the Alchemists' Guild. It makes me feel like an ant. Well, the fact he was here to hunt giant bugs didn't help much either. In any case, despite the novelty of this all, moving up and down the colossal structure was straightforward. Numerous suspension bridges had been built, linking the giant fungi together for everyone's convenience. What was more annoying was that he still had to circle a couple miles away from the entrance to the second level, as he didn't want Mickey anywhere near the crowded places. Only after he estimated to have traveled far enough did he call to the bird. Over here. Luckily, his friend didn't need bridges to navigate the spire. It only took him around 15 minutes to reach him. As soon as they had regrouped, Percy activated Soul Vision, looking for the wasps. Sadly, there didn't seem to be any around. Can you scout ahead? Caw. Mickey didn't need to be told twice, shooting out like an arrow. And hardly another 10 minutes passed before Percy received news of 2 nearby targets on the same mushroom, only a couple bridges away. Wait for me. Don't attack them. Percy knew Mickey could probably handle one of the starry workers by himself. He was an orange beast too, plus he was smarter and had some unique abilities giving him an edge. In fact, he figured they would have to split up in the future to hunt the creatures more efficiently. That said, today was their first day, so it was probably unwise to undertake any unnecessary risks before learning more about the bugs. They'd still try fighting individually, but they'd remain close to one another, to intervene if necessary. Caw. Caw. Mickey didn't sound very happy about it. He'd waited 2 days to get his talons on some tasty snacks fitting for his grade. Still, he listened to the young man, albeit begrudgingly. Once Percy arrived, he reactivated his soul vision, locating their target. The starry worker was much larger than the drones. At about the size of a fox, it was still on the smaller side as far as orange beasts were concerned. Still massive for a bug though. What gave Percy pause was a rather nasty stinger sticking out of the wasp's abdomen. It was longer than his index finger. Let's not get stabbed by that. Caw. From what he'd heard, the creatures were venomous. At least, their acid wasn't very potent, so it wouldn't be lethal unless they got hit in a vital area. It'd still be rather unpleasant though. Redoubling their caution, they spread out by a few paces, as he took a few deep breaths, drawing the mana to his second core while guiding even more into his channels. Less than a minute later, his muscles were brimming with strength, and his body spilling out mana, as he could practically feel the cyan lines thrumming underneath his skin. At least the robes are long-sleeved. It was one of the few saving graces of the guild's uniform. It only left his face and hands exposed, and the latter he had fixed by putting on a pair of gloves. Of course, he still very much hoped that nobody would pass through this remote region, but they'd be hunting around here for months. It was best to minimize the risk. Let me handle the first one by myself. With everything in order, Percy gathered some soul mana in his hand, before tossing the parting gift towards the wasp. It missed. Although annoyed, the young man wasn't surprised. Unfortunately, the insect wasn't sitting still. It was whizzing around, feeding on the colorful motes falling from the mushrooms above. Naturally, hitting it midair had been a long shot. It also hadn't been subtle. Beasts had keen senses, making it somewhat harder to catch them by surprise. It must have had its mana sense active, noticing the translucent dagger flying past it. Bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz. Before Percy knew it, the creature was upon him, and it appeared enraged. It tried to finish him directly by lunging straight towards his throat. It almost succeeded too, as it was faster than expected, making it difficult to sidestep even with circulation active. However, it wasn't as hard to divert the stinger with a flick of his quarterstaff. Still, the construct bent and cracked, barely shifting the trajectory of the stab by a couple inches, a bit too close for comfort. Rotating his right wrist anti-clockwise, Percy tried to use the rebound force from the parry to slam the other end of his weapon on the wasp, but he hit nothing but empty air. The creature flew around him erratically, looking for another opening to attack. It's really annoying. Percy's kit was not very suitable against this kind of opponent. His lack of defensive magic didn't afford him the luxury of blocking hits. He'd lose if he got stabbed even once. Of course, the combination of circulation and his second core put his reflexes solidly above a regular orange, meaning he could prevent that if he remained alert. Still, he didn't exactly have a good means of killing the slippery creature either. His staff was too weak, unless he landed a good blow on the wasp's wings. As for his parting gift, it was certainly powerful enough to finish the insect, but it wasn't easy hitting the bug with it. It cost a lot of mana and time for each shot, so he couldn't launch it very often either. Just stop moving, will you? 20 minutes and twice as many parting gifts later, the wasp was finally dead. The young man was lying on his back, drenched in sweat, his chest heaving up and down. Caw, caw. Percy grimaced, hearing the crow's ridicule. What? Think you can do better? Why don't you try taking on the other one by yourself then? Another 20 minutes later, it was Mickey's turn to lie with his back on the giant mushroom, as Percy stood over him with a grin. Flying in a straight line, the crow was much faster than the wasp, but that didn't account for the difference in agility. The bug could fly horizontally or vertically too, making it difficult for the familiar to pin it down. It was also rather dangerous, as the insect's maneuverability along with the stinger's greater reach had almost cost Mickey dearly a few times. Eventually, Percy had been forced to intervene, taking advantage of the situation to finish the creature. Caw. Yeah, we both suck, Percy agreed. Their first 2 kills on the second level hadn't been easy. It would be a while until they got any good at it. Let's try to hunt as many as possible for today. Depending on how bad it was, it might be better to stick to the bottom level. The young man sure hoped it wouldn't be necessary, but it would all come down to how much nectar they could harvest here and how much room for improvement there was. After emptying their spoils into a vial, they took off. Like before, Mickey headed out first, scouting for their next target. However, they wouldn't try fighting separately anymore. It might be something worth considering in the future, but Percy understood their best bet for today would be to team up against the bugs. The next 15 hours are going to be so much fun. Spoiler alert, they weren't.